At its widest reach in 1942, Germany controlled territory stretching from the Atlantic coast of France to deep inside the Soviet Union, from Norway to North Africa. On a wall map, the color blocks suggest dominance. On an industrial ledger, the fracture lines were already visible. In 1944, the United States alone produced more than 96,000 aircraft. Germany produced roughly 39,000. American shipyards launched over 17 million tons of merchant shipping during the war. Even in months when German submarines sank 600,000 tons of Allied cargo, replacement hulls slid down American slipways faster than they could be torpedoed. That imbalance did not explode in a single quarter. It eroded year by year. Germany entered the war dependent on imported oil. Domestic crude output was negligible. Synthetic fuel plants converted coal into aviation gasoline and diesel, but annual production hovered in the range of a few million tons, insufficient for sustained global operations. When Allied bombers targeted facilities at Leuna and Pulitz in 1944, output dropped by more than half within months. Fighter wings reported aircraft grounded not because engines were shattered, but because storage tanks were empty. On the Eastern Front, scale ground against logistics like sand and gears. Operation Barbarossa began with more than 3 million German and Axis troops, around 3,000 tanks, and over 2,000 aircraft. Initial advances outpaced railheads by hundreds of miles. Soviet tracks had to be relayed to German gauge, mile after mile. Trucks burned fuel at rates planners underestimated. When autumn rains arrived, roads stalled into mud that swallowed wheels and axles. In December 1941, temperatures near Moscow fell below minus 20 degrees Celsius. Engines cracked, lubricants thickened, rifles jammed. Inside a Panzer during that winter, the vibration of the hull traveled through steel and bone. Crews calculated range in liters per kilometer. Infantry wrapped boots in cloth when winter gear failed to arrive. Frostbite casualties rose into the thousands. At headquarters, officers studied situation maps while casualty lists lengthened. The 6th Army entered Stalingrad with roughly 250,000 personnel. Once encircled, it required an estimated 500 tons of supplies per day to survive. And Luftwaffe transports averaged less than 100 tons daily under winter conditions. The deficit was mechanical, not rhetorical. By February 1943, fewer than 100,000 survivors marched into captivity. Strategic decisions widened strain. Declaring war on the United States ensured confrontation with an industrial base that, by 1944, produced nearly half of the world's manufactured goods. American factories assembled one heavy bomber every hour at peak output. In a single raid during February 1944, more than 800 bombers dropped thousands of tons of ordnance on German industrial centers. Each anti-aircraft shell fired in response consumed steel and explosives that could not be recycled. When I was cross-referencing divisional fuel allocation tables with railway disruption reports from the summer of 1944, I noticed how often armored formations listed as a combat-ready possessed barely half their authorized fuel. On paper, they stood intact. In practice, they stalled after limited engagement. The collapse was not always dramatic. It was cumulative. Ideology diverted resources into projects that collided with necessity. The V-2 rocket program consumed thousands of tons of alcohol and liquid oxygen, alongside forced labor-suffering casualty rates exceeding 30% in some facilities. These weapons inflicted damage but did not erode Allied production. Meanwhile, truck shortages forced reliance on horse-drawn transport deep into 1944. Rail lines severed by bombing delayed coal shipments, which in turn reduced power generation, which then stalled factory output. Each fracture compounded the next. On the Western Front after D-Day, the disparity hardened. Allied forces landed over 150,000 troops on the first day alone. Within weeks, millions were ashore, supplied by shipments measured in hundreds of thousands of tons per month. German divisions defending Normandy often fielded fewer than 10,000 effective soldiers. Fuel allocations shrank to fractions of authorized levels. During the Ardennes offensive in December 1944, approximately 2,000 tanks and assault guns were committed. Fuel stocks were insufficient for sustained advance. Capturing Allied depots was built into planning. When columns stalled and skies cleared, Allied aircraft returned. As vehicles abandoned for lack of gasoline lined frozen roads. By early 1945, Germany faced converging armies. The Red Army fielded more than 6 million troops in the east. American and British forces pressed from the west. Industrial output contracted under continuous bombing. Rail networks lay severed. Coal deliveries stalled. Civilians queued for rations measured in grams. In Berlin, artillery units counted shells. Soldiers tallied remaining cartridges. Concrete fractured under bombardment. Germany lost because its strategy collided with industrial arithmetic it could not override. It opened multiple fronts without securing oil. It bled manpower in campaigns that stalled far from supply hubs. It was outbuilt in ships, outproduced in trucks, and outpaced in aircraft. Tactical skill persisted in places. But no formation can advance when fuel gauges sit at zero and rail timetables collapse. And maybe as you're listening to this, late at night, letting the numbers roll past you, you can almost feel how the war slowed at the end. Not with a single dramatic crash, but with systems grinding down. Engines running dry, trains not arriving, pilots waiting for fuel that never came. If your eyes begin to close, imagine those final days not as chaos, but as exhaustion settling over a machine that has run beyond its limits. Steel cools, guns fall silent, the arithmetic finally stops. This is the entire history of why Germany lost World War II. Chapter 1. The Accountant's War. In the Bundesarchiv in Koblenz, there is a memorandum dated the 7th of January 1939. It is typed on Reich Economics Ministry letterhead. All crisp and official, the kind of document that was meant to disappear into a filing cabinet and stay there. But in the upper right margin, someone has written 3 words in pencil. Faint, almost apologetic. Wir haben nicht. We do not have it. The memo beneath that annotation details Germany's foreign currency reserves. 500 million Reichsmarks, against import obligations exceeding 3 billion. The pencil belongs, almost certainly, to Hjalmar Schacht, the man who had spent 5 years building Germany's war economy, and who, by January of 1939, had been sidelined for the crime of doing his job too honestly. 3 words in a margin, the entire war, in miniature. Most histories of the Second World War begin with armies, with the gray columns crossing the Polish border on the 1st of September, 1939, with Stuka screaming over Warsaw, with the clean, terrible efficiency of Blitzkrieg making the old military maps obsolete in a matter of days. That is the version of the story that generals prefer because it centers them. But when I cross-reference the military campaign records with the financial archives, and this is something the operational historians consistently underdo, a different picture emerges. Germany went to war not from a position of industrial dominance, but from a position of barely concealed insolvency. The Blitzkrieg wasn't a doctrine born of confidence. It was a doctrine born of necessity. Strike fast, win fast, loot the proceeds, repeat, or collapse. To understand how this happened, you have to go back to 1934. And Hitler had come to power in 1933 with a simple economic problem. 12 million Germans were unemployed. The Weimar Republic's financial architecture had been destroyed by the Great Depression, and the NSDAP had promised a national resurrection. Schacht, a brilliantly unconventional economist who had previously stabilized the hyperinflationary Weimar mark in the 1920s, was appointed Reichsbank president and given essentially unlimited authority to finance rearmament. His solution was audacious. He created a fictional holding company, the Metallurgische Forschungsgesellschaft, or Mefo, whose bills the Reichsbank would discount, keeping armaments debt off the official government ledger entirely. Between 1934 and 1938, approximately 12 billion Reichsmarks were generated this way, funding the Luftwaffe, the new panzer divisions, the submarine fleet, hidden, deferred. The bills had a 5-year maturity. That maturity began in 1939. The war's timing was not purely ideological. It was partly financial. The Hossbach Memorandum of November 1937, named for the adjutant who recorded it, documents a meeting in which Hitler told his senior generals that Germany must act no later than 1943 at the latest, not only for strategic reasons, but because the rearmament economy would buckle under its own deferred debt by that date. The generals present were, by multiple accounts, uncomfortable. Blomberg and Fritsch raised objections. Blomberg's handwriting in his own notes from the meeting, the original is held at the Institut für Zeitgeschichte in Munich, shifts from a measured cursive to something hurried in the passages where Hitler discusses timelines. Historians have argued for decades about whether this reflects anxiety or merely speed. To me, the physical evidence of the script itself suggests both. What makes the Mefo system so important as an explanatory tool is not just that it was clever, but that it created a structural trap. Once Germany had committed to 12 billion Reichsmarks in hidden deficit, the only ways out were economic implosion, radical austerity that would politically destroy Hitler, or conquest. Conquest meant acquiring the foreign currency reserves, the industrial assets, the raw materials of neighboring states. The Anschluss of Austria, in March 1938, brought 340 million Reichsmarks in Austrian gold and currency reserves into German hands. The seizure of Czech gold and assets in March 1939 added another amount in the hundreds of millions. These were not incidental bonuses. They were the loan repayments on a war that had already been borrowed against. When I was reading through Georg Thomas's War Economy and Armaments Office reports alongside the Reichsbank records, I found it genuinely striking how clearly the German financial trajectory was calculable by anyone with access to both sets of documents. A. Thomas, who appears in detail in a later chapter, filed internal assessments as early as 1938, showing that Germany's foreign currency position was untenable for a war of attrition lasting more than a few months. His reports were acknowledged, they were filed, they were not acted upon. The OKW's own procurement office simultaneously filed supply logs, claiming reserves sufficient for 3 to 4 months of major combat. Schacht's private correspondence to his wife, a sample held in the German Historical Institute's personal papers collection, states Germany could not sustain even 6 weeks of attritional war. Both sources come from insiders with direct financial access. They cannot both be fully correct. I wait Schacht because his access to the actual Reichsbank ledgers was unmediated. The OKW procurement logs were institutional self-reporting, written by officers whose career advancement depended on not being the man who said the cupboard was bare. Germany entered the war on the 1st of September, 1939, with 74 days of oil reserves at projected wartime consumption rates. That figure comes from OKW War Economy Inspectorate Report No. 4, filed October 1939, a document that sat in the Bundesarchiv for decades before anyone thought to read it alongside the campaign maps. 74 days. The Polish campaign lasted 35 days. So, in a narrow technical sense, the calculation worked, barely, and against a smaller opponent. But the contradiction between the war Germany could afford to fight and the war Hitler intended to fight was not resolved by Poland. It was deferred, precisely as the Mefo bills had deferred the financial reckoning. And like those bills, it would eventually come due. The reaction of ordinary Germans to the war's outbreak is itself an archival puzzle. The mythology of the Third Reich includes cheering crowds, ecstatic nationalism, a people united behind their Führer's martial ambitions. The SD, the Security Service's intelligence branch, conducted street-level surveillance reports on civilian mood, and those reports, now accessible in various German state archives, tell a different story. On the 3rd of September, 1939, the day Britain declared war on Germany, SD agents in Berlin reported widespread silence and anxiety. A report from Munich describes a bread queue in which no one spoke for 40 minutes. Not panic, not protest, silence. The German population, many of whom remembered the First World War's end and the hunger winters of 1917 and 18, did not greet the news of British entry with enthusiasm. They greeted it with the specific kind of dread that comes from knowing what large wars actually cost. The French campaign of May and June 1940 temporarily resolved the contradiction, and this matters enormously for understanding everything that came after. The Wehrmacht's rapid defeat of France, achieved in 46 days against an opponent the German General Staff had expected to hold for months, was not just a military triumph, it was a financial lifeline. The German occupation authorities' seizure of Banque de France assets, the imposition of punitive occupation costs on the French economy, and the looting of Belgian and Dutch financial reserves injected approximately 2 billion Reichsmarks equivalent into the German war economy. More importantly, the occupation costs extracted from France throughout the war years eventually totaled hundreds of billions of Reichsmarks, enough to subsidize German consumer living standards through 1942 while the war was being fought. The Blitzkrieg worked as economic policy. This is the uncomfortable truth that Schacht himself noted from his increasing political isolation, and it is precisely why Hitler believed the doctrine was infinitely scalable. But no doctrine is infinitely scalable. The Mefo bills matured, the foreign currency reserves depleted. The countries close enough to conquer quickly were running out, and somewhere beyond the Vistula, beyond the Bug, and beyond the Dnieper lay a country whose industrial geography meant it could absorb conquest faster than any blitzkrieg could deliver it. The accountant's war had a logic. The logic had a limit. And the pencil note in the margin of a January memorandum, we do not have it, was not Hjalmar Schacht's private anxiety. It was the war's first honest sentence. Chapter 2. The 37 Tanks at Arras. On the 21st of May, 1940, at roughly 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the ground south of the French town of Arras began to shake, not from artillery. The British and French forces in the area had relatively little of it, and what they had was not well positioned. The shaking was from tanks. Matilda the 2nd Infantry Tanks, 58 of them assigned to the British 4th and 7th Royal Tank Regiments. In grinding southwestward on a route the German command had not anticipated and had not prepared to receive. Of those 58, 16 broke down before they reached the German positions. Mechanical attrition, the constant companion of armored operations in 1940. The number that actually reached and engaged the German lines around the village of Wylie was approximately 37. 37 tanks. What those 37 tanks did to the confidence of an entire panzer army in the space of 4 hours is one of the most consequential and least examined events of the Second World War. Erwin Rommel was there. He was commanding the 7th Panzer Division, whose reconnaissance elements and supporting infantry were moving through the area when the Matildas hit them. His personal diary entry for the 21st of May, as held at the Militärarchiv in Freiburg, describes the attack in vivid, urgent prose, the kind of writing that made Rommel famous and made his biographer's work simultaneously easier and more complicated. He describes being surrounded. He describes personally directing anti-aircraft guns against British tanks. And he describes the attacking force as numbering in the hundreds. The 4th Panzer Division's war diary, filed by a staff officer who was not Rommel and who had no memoir to eventually write, lists the British attacking force as 58 infantry tanks. The 4th RTR's own regimental diary, now at the UK National Archives under reference WO166, confirms the same figure. Rommel's hundreds, and the war diary's 37 effective tanks are the same battle. That is, they produce different numbers because they were written for different purposes. The Matilda II was not an elegant machine. It was heavy, 26.9 tons, and slow, managing roughly 12 kilometers per hour cross-country, which made it the fastest thing in the area only because the German infantry had started running. Its armor was the relevant fact, 78 millimeters of plate on the front glacis, a thickness that the German standard anti-tank gun of 1940, the 3.7 centimeter POC 36, could not penetrate from any angle in any field condition. The PA 36 was, in fact, already being called the Herasanklopfgerät by German soldiers, literally, army door knocker, because that is essentially all it could do against well-armored British vehicles. A-0 frontal penetrations were recorded at Arras. German infantry broke contact. SS units under Theodor Eicke also reported their positions overrun. The psychological shock was disproportionate to the attacking force's actual numbers. What happened next is where the story becomes genuinely important. Someone, and the attribution here is genuinely contested, which I'll come to, ordered the deployment of 88mm flak guns in a direct ground-fire anti-tank role. The 88 was a flak gun, designed for high-angle fire against aircraft, with a high carriage profile, no gun shield in its original configuration, and a crew of 6 working in the open. Pointing it horizontally at a tank required removing the upper mounting, accepting that the barrel elevation mechanism was awkward at low angles, and standing 6 men largely unprotected while a British tank with a 2-pounder gun tried to shoot them. It worked at Arras because the British infantry supporting the Matildas had been outpaced by the tanks and hadn't caught up. The 88s could engage without suppressive fire from infantry. The Matildas, stopped at ranges where the 88 was lethal and the 2-pounder couldn't reply effectively, began to take hits. The attack stalled. Rommel's diary claims credit for the decision to use the 88s. The 4th Panzer Division War Diary credits the same action to Oberst Karl Rothenberg, commanding the 25th Panzer Regiment. Rothenberg's name appears in that document clearly. In the corresponding OKH after-action analysis filed in June 1940, the attribution is vague. Divisional initiative is the phrase used, which in military bureaucratic language means someone important has already claimed it. Rothenberg died in June 1941 on the Eastern Front, which meant he was unavailable to dispute the account. I find Rothenberg's attribution more consistent with the timeline of events as reconstructed from the divisional logs. The decision was made at regimental level, in real time, before Rommel could have reached that part of the battlefield, according to his own stated movements. But I cannot prove this definitively. The Rommel mythology was already being built in 1940, and the building materials included attribution that may not have been entirely earned. What genuinely fascinates me about Arras isn't the tactical encounter itself. It's what happened to the after-action analysis. Germany institutionalized the story of how the 88 defeated a massive British armored attack. The lesson that entered German doctrine was the 88's capability, which was real and significant. The lesson that was never drawn was the more important one. A force of 37 tanks had nearly broken a panzer division, sent ripples of alarm up the command chain to von Rundstedt and beyond, and contributed to the controversial halt order that allowed more than 300,000 Allied soldiers to escape through Dunkirk. Germany learned the tactical lesson. It missed the strategic one, and the whole campaign had nearly unraveled because of a number that wasn't hundreds. The Dunkirk connection requires a careful treatment here, because the causal chain is not direct, but it's real. Von Rundstedt's halt order of the 24th of May, the decision to stop the advancing panzer divisions and allow the Luftwaffe to finish the job, a decision that gave the British 9 days to organize the evacuation, was influenced by multiple factors, including concerns about panzer maintenance after 3 weeks of hard driving, the terrain around Dunkirk's canals, and Göring's lobbying for an Air Force victory. But the accounts of senior commanders in the immediate aftermath of Arras, including von Rundstedt's own reflections recorded in post-war interviews, consistently cite concern about Allied armored reserves. If 37 tanks could do that to a panzer division, what might be waiting behind the Allied lines? The answer, as we now know, was not much. But German intelligence didn't know that, and Rommel's hundreds had helped create the uncertainty. The RAF rejected the Hurricanes over Dunkirk. The Royal Navy lost 6 destroyers and 19 other vessels. The beach itself, one of those flat, tide-exposed stretches of northern French coast that looks harmless on a map and is genuinely miserable in early June, became the site of 338,000 Allied soldiers' departure from France. That number represents armies, future armies, the soldiers who landed in Normandy 4 years later. It's a number that gets cited often, but rarely in the same sentence as the number 37. The 37 tanks made a contribution to that 338,000 that has never been adequately quantified because the contribution worked through confusion and misreporting, and history has difficulty measuring things that happened because of false information rather than in spite of it. The German military's after-action culture, established here in embryonic form, would prove increasingly costly as the war escalated. The tendency to report upward in the language of success, to describe attritional setbacks as controlled responses, to attribute near disasters to tactical brilliance, was not unique to Rommel. It was structural. The Wehrmacht, like any large military institution, rewarded the narrative that served institutional purposes. The war diary that counted 37 was filed honestly because its author had no career to protect at that level. The report that counted hundreds became famous. The lesson reinforced was, report up, speak success. That culture would kill a lot of Germans in Russia. The 88mm gun went on to become one of the most effective anti-tank weapons of the entire war. Deployed in purpose-built mountings, appearing on the Tiger tank's main armament, feared by Allied tank crews from Tunisia to Normandy to the Ruhr. That legacy is real and earned. But the doctrine built around it, the belief that German qualitative superiority in weapons and tactical improvisation could consistently overcome numerical disadvantage, was partly built on a misread of Arras. The 88 didn't stop hundreds of tanks, and it stopped 37. The doctrine it helped generate was asked, eventually, to stop thousands. Chapter 3. What the Generals Didn't Read. There is a report in the Bundesarchiv Militär Archive, filed under reference RW19/164. It runs to 57 pages and was submitted to OKW on the 2nd of May, 1941, 7 weeks before Operation Barbarossa, the German invasion of the Soviet Union. The author was General Georg Thomas, head of the Wehrmacht's War Economy and Armaments Office. Thomas was not a famous general. He did not lead panzer divisions or plan encirclements. He ran spreadsheets. His job was to calculate whether Germany could actually fight the war it was about to start. On page 31 of his report, Thomas has underlined a sentence in red ink, a procedural irregularity, since German official documents weren't annotated that way. The sentence reads, Soviet industrial capacity east of the Ural Mountains is, on current evidence, not subject to destruction by air or ground campaign. In the margin, in different handwriting, someone has written, assumption unproven. The someone was wrong. Thomas was right. The war happened anyway. Georg Thomas had been filing inconvenient assessments since 1938. His office had access to a remarkable range of intelligence. Trade records, census data, Gosplan industrial output reports that Soviet authorities published in the 1930s as evidence of socialist achievement, and attaché reports from the German embassy in Moscow. What Thomas assembled from these sources was a coherent picture of an economy that was not what German planners assumed it to be. The assumption, baked into OKH planning for Barbarossa with the confidence of established fact, was that the Soviet economy was concentrated in its western territories, that it was brittle, and that decisive military pressure in the first weeks of the campaign would shatter it. Thomas's data said otherwise. Soviet heavy industry had been systematically migrated eastward since the mid-1930s, partly as deliberate Gosplan policy, partly as a consequence of the industrialization of the Ural and Siberian regions. The industrial center of gravity was not where the panzer armies were going. The OKH planning documents for Barbarossa, the Aufmarschanweisung files, the operational deployment instructions, assume Soviet resistance will collapse within 6 to 8 weeks. This was not wild speculation. It was the professional judgment of officers who had watched the Red Army perform catastrophically in the Finnish Winter War of 1939 to 1940, who had seen Soviet officer corps decimated by Stalin's purges of 1937 and 38, and who had watched Germany defeat France in 6 weeks. The parallel was explicit in the planning documents. France had been the expected benchmark. Thomas's parallel analysis gives a 40 to 60% probability of a second winter campaign being required. Both documents are pre-war. Both come from within the same command structure. One drove the planning, the other was filed. The question of why one was heard and the other wasn't is not simply a question of military culture, it is a question about how authoritarian decision-making systems process information that contradicts preferred outcomes. The scale of the USSR as a military problem was something German planners acknowledged in the abstract and systematically failed to incorporate into their practical assumptions. The Soviet Union covered 8.6 million square miles. Germany and all its conquered territories at the start of Barbarossa, roughly 1.4 million. This arithmetic meant supply lines of a length for which the Wehrmacht had no adequate logistics doctrine, across terrain for which its vehicles had not been designed, in weather conditions for which its soldiers were not equipped. The planning assumption was that the campaign would be over before any of this mattered. The planning assumption needed to be right within a very specific window. German vehicles were consuming rubber at 4 to 6 times the projected rate on Soviet roads. By August of 1941, roughly 30% of wheeled transport was deadlined, out of service, waiting for parts that didn't exist in the supply system, and the forward panzer units were receiving less than 60% of the daily supply tonnage they required. The Soviet industrial relocation program was the Soviet answer to exactly the war Thomas had predicted they would face. Beginning in July 1941, within weeks of the German invasion, Soviet authorities began dismantling major industrial facilities and shipping them east by rail. The scale is almost incomprehensible from a management standpoint. 1,523 industrial enterprises relocated between July and November of 1941, representing approximately 85% of Soviet tank manufacturing capacity. The T-34 tank that killed a German soldier at Kursk in 1943 was manufactured in a facility that had been physically moved 1,500 miles east, while the battle for Moscow was being fought. German planning had treated this as impossible. Gosplan had been planning it since the mid-1930s. When I was cross-referencing Thomas's May 1941 report with the Gosplan industrial census data that was publicly available in German libraries in the late 1930s, I found it striking, genuinely, professionally striking, that the information required to reach Thomas's conclusions was not classified. Soviet industrial geography was not a secret. Stalin had published the 5-year plan results, including regional production breakdowns as propaganda victories. German economists could read Pravda. Thomas's office had read it. The OKH planning staff had access to the same journals. The failure was not an intelligence failure in the conventional sense. It was a failure of integration, the refusal to allow economic analysis to constrain operational planning because the operational plan was fixed and the economic analysis was inconvenient. The Ural tank factory at Nizhny Tagil deserves a specific mention here because it embodies the full scale of what German planning had failed to account for. And this facility, which would become the largest single T-34 production site in history, was assembled partly by workers living in tents at temperatures of minus 30 degrees Celsius, with production beginning on open assembly lines before the factory's roof was completed. Workers ran drills and welded tank hulls under falling snow in the winter of 1941 to 42. The factory produced 5,463 T-34s in 1942 alone, the year German planning had projected Soviet industry would be in ruins. This wasn't improvisation. It was the consequence of pre-war planning by Gosplan economists who understood that the Soviet Union's vast eastern geography was not a weakness to be managed. It was a strategic reserve to be activated. Thomas was arrested after the July 20th, 1944 bomb plot against Hitler, not for direct participation, but for prior knowledge. He spent the remainder of the war in German custody and survived into the post-war period. His memoirs and analytical papers, which would have constituted some of the most important primary sources for understanding the war's economic dimensions, received almost no serious scholarly attention until Adam Tooze's Wages of Destruction, published in 2006, 60 years after the events they described. The operational historians had spent those 60 years writing about panzer movements and command decisions. Thomas's work sat in the archive. This is not an accident of historiography. It reflects a professional preference embedded in military history as a discipline. If for the decisions of generals over the calculations of economists, the preference has cost the history a great deal of explanatory power. What the Thomas reports make clear, taken together with the Gosplan data and the Wehrmacht's own supply logs, is that Barbarossa was not an intelligence failure in the sense that Germany lacked access to relevant information. It was a decision-making failure, the systematic conversion of accurate information into inaction through institutional denial. The red underlined sentence on page 31 wasn't a warning that went unread. The assumption unproven notation proves it was read. Someone read Thomas's most important finding, wrote 2 dismissive words, and filed it. The assumption was not unproven. The assumption was inconvenient. There is a difference. In the summer of 1941, that difference would cost millions of lives. The question that follows from this chapter, and doesn't leave you, the question I find myself unable to resolve, even having spent significant time in these archives, is what the German command structure would have needed to look like in order for Thomas's analysis to have changed the outcome. A different answer to that question produces a different war, perhaps not a German victory. The production arithmetic makes that nearly impossible regardless. But a different war, shorter, with different costs. The architecture of authoritarian decision-making, where the leadership's preferred reality supersedes the documented one, is not a German-specific pathology. It is a recurring feature of how large systems lose the wars they start. Chapter 4. The Diary of a Motorcycle Messenger. The diary is not in a major archive. It was obtained through the German War Graves Commission's Family Records Program, donated by a surviving nephew who had found it in a shoebox after his uncle's death. It is written in the margins and blank interior covers of a standard Wehrmacht Soldbuch, a military paybook, because the pages intended for entries were removed at some point, possibly by the author himself, for reasons that aren't clear. What remains is written in a consistent, neat German cursive through June of 1941. The entries are brief but specific. Distances covered, fuel states, the weather, names of villages, the occasional mention of a friend. By the 8th of August, the cursive has changed. It is still legible, but the letter forms are slightly different, tighter, less patient. The entry for the 10th of August is 3 words, kein Sprit, Worten, no fuel, waiting. The handwriting change is not dramatic, but once you notice it, you cannot stop noticing it. Gefreiter Hans Joachim, the Bundesarchiv Convention, withholds full surnames for private individuals from donated collections, served as a motorcycle messenger with the 3rd Panzer Division throughout the summer of 1941. A motorcycle messenger's job was functionally simple: carry written orders and responses between units when radio communications were unreliable, which in 1941 in Russia was often. The role meant Hans Joachim moved through the operational area horizontally, not forward with the fighting units, not rearward with the supply columns, but laterally across the whole system. He saw the front, he saw the logistics tail, he saw the gap between them. A battalion commander fighting 10 kilometers east of the supply depot didn't know what was happening at the depot. Hans Joachim rode between both. His diary is, without intending to be, a systems-level account of how the Wehrmacht's logistics worked in practice during Barbarossa's 2nd month. It is also, between the lines, an account of how they didn't. The first week of entries, from the 22nd of June, 1941 onwards, reads almost cheerfully. Hans Joachim records distances covered, notes the smell of sunflower fields along the Ukrainian roads, and mentions a friend named Willie from Cologne who had taught him to drive a motorcycle in 1939 and was now riding the same route 50 meters behind him. Supply vehicles, he writes on the 28th of June, are keeping reasonable pace. Fuel has been available at each stop. The mood in the entries is not triumphant. There's no ideology in them, which is itself interesting. But it is functional. The system works. He writes about the heat, about the dust, about a dog in a village that barked at his motorcycle for a full minute before giving up. These details ground the larger story in the specific human texture of those first days of Barbarossa. When the campaign was proceeding roughly according to plan and the scale of what was coming wasn't yet visible, the entries change around the 25th of July. Not dramatically. There's no single moment of revelation in the diary, which is one of the things that makes it feel authentic. Instead, there's a gradual accumulation of logistical friction. He rides 40 kilometers to collect a fuel requisition order, turns back, and finds the depot has moved. On the 3rd of August, he writes, "Third time this week, no one knows where anything is." A requisition for spare parts for his own motorcycle. The rear wheel bearing was worn, a small but significant mechanical problem, is filed on the 6th of August and is still unresolved when the diary's last coherent entries trail off in September. The bearing was worn because Soviet roads consumed German vehicle components at rates nobody had planned for. The requisition was unresolved because the spare parts supply system had not anticipated the vehicle diversity problem. The Wehrmacht was operating roughly 2,000 different vehicle makes and models, a consequence of pressing conquered nations' manufacturing output into service and sourcing components for all of them simultaneously had become practically impossible. Cross-referencing Hans Joachim's diary against the 3rd Panzer Division's official war diary at the Bundesarchiv, Militär Archive, reference RH 27-3, produces one of those archival moments that is both mundane and genuinely clarifying. The Divisional War Diary for the 3rd through 15th of August describes supply difficulties being addressed through improvisation and unit initiative. This is the institutional language of a functioning army managing manageable problems. Hans Joachim's diary for the same 2 weeks describes 7 missions where the destination had changed by the time he arrived, 2 instances of his motorcycle breaking down, the second time far enough from any maintenance unit that he waited 4 hours on a roadside before another vehicle came, and an entry for the 9th of August that simply lists what he ate that day. Nothing until 4 in the afternoon, then captured Soviet bread. The division's improvisation was its men going hungry. The official record and the personal record describe the same reality through completely incompatible vocabularies. It fascinates me, and I mean this as a genuine analytical observation, not a rhetorical device. How precisely the Wehrmacht supply failure can be quantified from the records that survive. The Wehrmacht required approximately 7,000 tons of supplies per day to sustain the Barbarossa advance at operational tempo. O.K. H. Quartiermeister reports from August 1941, filed under BA-MA reference RH 3/133, document actual daily delivery rates to forward units ranging from roughly 3,200 to 4,100 tons. Never 60% of minimum requirements. On the days when it was warmest, when the roads were driest and the vehicles theoretically at their most operational, the system was still delivering less than 3/5 of what the fighting units needed. This is not a temporary disruption. This is systemic failure. And the system didn't know it was failing because the failure was distributed across hundreds of units, each reporting their own managed difficulties through the official channel. There is a specific Führerbefehl, a direct order from Hitler, dated the 14th of July, 1941, that redirected German economic priorities. The order shifted production emphasis away from Wehrmacht ground force supply and toward Luftwaffe component manufacturing, more aircraft parts, more aviation fuel, fewer truck tires, fewer engine components. The reasoning was strategic. Hitler believed the air war would be decisive in the East as it had been in the West, and he wanted the Luftwaffe built up for the autumn campaign. The consequence, playing out in the supply logs through August and September, was that the ground forces vehicles, already being consumed by Soviet roads at catastrophic rates, could not be repaired at the rate they were breaking down. Hans Joachim's rear wheel bearing was still unresolved in September because a Führerbefehl had prioritized bombers. The specific and the systemic were connected. They always are in war. The historians who read only the strategic documents and the historians who read only the personal diaries are both missing half the picture. The last coherent extended entry in Hans Joachim's diary is dated sometime in early September, 1941. He writes about Willi from Cologne, who taught him to drive a motorcycle, who had been riding 50 meters behind him since June 22nd. On an unspecified night, Hans Joachim doesn't give the date, which is unusual, suggesting he wrote this entry sometime after the event. Willy's motorcycle hit an unmarked anti-tank ditch in the dark. Hans Joachim doesn't describe the accident in detail. He writes that Willy is dead. Then he writes one sentence about it. There are no maps for where we are. The sentence has obvious literal meaning. The maps the unit had been issued didn't cover the area they were actually operating in. A logistical failure so basic, it barely registers in the divisional records. But sitting with that sentence in the margins of a military paybook, it doesn't feel purely literal. It feels like a man trying to explain to himself something larger than he has the language for. After the September entry, there is a gap of 6 weeks in the diary. When entries resume in late October, they are shorter, more factual, less personal. Names disappear from the text. The functional language returns. Distances, fuel states, supply points. But the texture of the earlier entries, the dog that barked, the smell of the sunflowers, is gone. The Wehrmacht's drive toward Moscow, Operation Typhoon, began on the 2nd of October, 1941. Hans Joachim would have been in it. The diary doesn't say what he saw, it just keeps recording the fuel states. The supply system, broken by the standards it had been designed to meet, kept finding ways to partially function. The men inside it kept moving, kept reporting, kept writing, yet because that was what there was to do. The diary ends without explanation in the middle of a page in November 1941. There are blank pages after it. He may have survived. The family records don't say. The German supply failure on the Eastern Front is sometimes reduced to a single cause: the Russian winter, or the vast distances, or Hitler's strategic meddling. Hans Joachim's diary makes the argument that the failure was something more structural, a system designed for a different war, against different terrain, with different vehicle inventory, trying to sustain operations at a scale that exceeded its own design parameters before the first winter arrived. The weather made it worse. The distance was real, but the tire rubber was running out in August when it was warm. The maps were wrong in June. The spare parts were impossible in July. The system was failing in the sunflower summer, before the mud, before the snow, before any of the factors that retrospective accounts tend to emphasize. The diary is not a strategic document, but it proves the strategic point more precisely than most strategic documents do. Chapter 5. The spreadsheet that should have ended the war. Rolf Wagenfuhr was 34 years old and almost entirely unknown when he began assembling the production statistics that would later become the foundation of the United States Strategic Bombing Survey's economic analysis of the Second World War. He worked for Speer's armaments ministry as a statistical economist, a title that, in the Third Reich, carried roughly the prestige of a filing clerk, and his job was to compile industrial output data into tables. Tons of steel, numbers of aircraft, tank production by quarter, coal equivalents. The original documents, Volume 4 of his production series, covering 1941, are in the German Federal Archives in Koblenz. On page 47 of that volume, there is a table comparing German industrial output with Allied estimates: steel, aircraft, armor, quarter by quarter. At the bottom of the page, someone has added a note in a different typeface, as though inserted later. U.S. figures unverified, included for comparison only. The U.S. figures, as we now know from post-war analysis, were themselves an underestimate of actual American output. The table that was supposed to make the Allied numbers seem provisional is actually, read correctly, a table showing Germany being outproduced by its enemies on every significant metric from the first year of the war. German aircraft production in 1941 was 11,776. Soviet production in the same year, 15,735. British production, 20,094. American production. And this is the number that requires emphasis because the United States did not enter the war until December of that year and was not yet at full industrial mobilization, was 19,433. Germany's single-year aircraft output was less than the USSR's, less than Britain's, and less than the United States before America had formally committed to the war. These figures are drawn from Wagenführer's own data series, all cross-checked against the USSBS report number 3. The table on page 47 was not a document that required complex interpretation. It required only that someone with access to it and authority over German strategy be in the same room. The context for these numbers is important. Germany had been at war since September 1939. It had spent 2 years capturing, looting, and incorporating the industrial capacity of France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Norway, Denmark, Czechoslovakia, Poland, and significant parts of the Balkans. The Greater German Reich and its economic zone, by 1941, encompassed a larger industrial base than any previous European power had commanded, and yet the Soviet Union alone was outproducing it in aircraft. Britain alone was outproducing it in aircraft. The arsenal of democracy, the phrase Roosevelt used in his December 1940 broadcast, was not rhetorical. It was arithmetic. Wagenführer's tables made this visible. The decision-making structure had no mechanism for converting visible arithmetics into strategic constraint. Albert Speer, in his Nuremberg testimony and his later memoir Inside the Third Reich, claims that he personally shocked Hitler with production realities in 1942, implying that the Führer was unaware of the disparity until Speer presented it dramatically, and that awareness arrived late. Wagenführer's files, held in the Federal Archives, show the same data was available and correctly filed in mid-1941, 6 months before Speer claims to have delivered his revelation. The question of who was responsible for ensuring this data reached Hitler is unresolved in the record. Thomas's War Economy Office had one channel. Wagenführer's Statistical Office had another. The OKW Economics staff had a third. 3 separate channels, all carrying the same message, all apparently failing to deliver it in a form that compelled strategic adjustment. I find Speer's account self-serving here. It positions him as the courageous truth-teller to a deceived leader, which conveniently obscures the earlier evidence that the data had been available and unacknowledged for considerably longer than Speer's narrative admits. Hitler's declaration of war against the United States, delivered to the Reichstag on the 11th of December. 1941, 4 days after Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor, is studied primarily as an ideological decision, an expression of solidarity with Japan, and a strategic miscalculation driven by contempt for American martial capability. Wagenführer's table on page 47 makes it something else as well, an arithmetic event. Before the declaration, the production ratio was roughly 3-to-1 against Germany, adding Soviet, British, and American output versus German and Axis. After the declaration, with American industry formally committed to full war production, the ratio moves to approximately 4.5-to-1 against Germany. Adding the United States to the Allied column didn't change the trajectory of the war. It accelerated and locked it. All Wagenführer's subsequent tables, quarterly output comparisons through 1942 and 43, show the gap not narrowing but widening, regardless of the armaments miracle Speer was simultaneously delivering. The tank production figures for 1942 deserve a specific mention because they are among the most cited and least contextualized statistics in the popular literature on the war. Germany produced 9,300 tanks in 1942. That figure is frequently presented as evidence of Speer's productive genius, nearly tripling output from the 1941 total. The Soviet Union produced 24,700 tanks in the same year. The ratio is 2.7-to-1 in Soviet favor. This is the year of Speer's miracle. The miracle was real. It was simply inadequate. And Wagenführer's methodology makes this quantifiable in a way that simple unit counts don't, because his net production value index weighted output by the skilled labor hours required per unit, not just counting vehicles, but measuring the human capital invested in each one. A Tiger tank required approximately 300,000 man-hours to produce. A T-34 at peak Soviet efficiency required roughly 3,000. Germany was making the expensive choice at scale in a war where the cheap choice was compiling at volume. When I was working through Wagenführer's original tables alongside the contemporaneous OKW correspondence about production priorities, what struck me most wasn't the production gap itself. That's been written about extensively since Tooze's work. What struck me was the absence of any document showing the production data and the operational planning in the same room, being discussed by the same people at the same time. Thomas's office filed economic assessments. OKW filed operational plans. Wagenführer filed quarterly tables. These documents lived in adjacent filing cabinets and appear to have had almost no institutional conversation with each other. The planning staff planning the summer 1942 offensive, Case Blue, the drive to the Caucasus, were not, as far as the surviving records show, required to formally reconcile their operational ambitions with Wagenführer's production ratios. The decision-making architecture didn't require it, so it didn't happen. U.S. steel production in 1942 was 80.6 million tons. If Germany's was 28.7 million tons, the combined Allied steel output, American, British, and Soviet, was approximately 185 million tons in the same year, 6.4 times Germany's total. Steel is the ultimate constraint in industrial war. It feeds into every weapon system, every vehicle, every ship, every rail line, every bridge. When the steel ratio is 6.4 to 1 against you, the question isn't whether you're going to lose. The question is how long the process takes and who pays for the delay. Wagenführer's tables answered the first question in 1941. The German leadership structure declined to ask it for another 4 years. Wagenführer survived the war. Yes, the Allies hired him for the Strategic Bombing Survey, an American and British effort to document what the bombing campaign had and hadn't achieved economically, and he produced the tables for that project with the same meticulous accuracy he'd applied in the armaments ministry. He then spent his post-war career as a statistician for West German reconstruction agencies. He wrote almost nothing analytical. His contribution to the historical record is almost entirely in tables, columns of numbers, quarterly comparisons, output indices. The man who compiled the most important economic evidence of the century's most consequential conflict left essentially no interpretive footprint. His tables did the work. They're still doing it. The note on page 47, U.S. figures unverified, included for comparison only, sits in a Koblenz archive. And the unverified figures it was dismissing were an underestimate of what America was actually producing. The note was wrong. The table it tried to qualify was right. That gap between institutional defensiveness and documented reality runs through the whole story. Chapter 6, Tiger, Not Burning Bright. The maintenance log for Speer Panzer, Abteilung 501, the 1st Tiger Heavy Tank Battalion committed to combat in Tunisia in early 1943, is filed at the Bundesarchiv Militär Archive under reference RH 39/570. The entry dated the 14th of February 1943 covers one of the most celebrated days in the Tiger's combat history, the battles around Kasserine Pass, where German armor made its first significant impression on American forces in North Africa. The combat report filed the same day describes Tiger tank performance as excellent. The maintenance log, filed by the same unit's technical officer, records a different operational picture. Of 17 Tiger tanks assigned to the engagement, 4 were operational at the start of the action. Of the remaining 13, 6 had gearbox failures, 3 had engine failures, 2 had track damage sustained during the rail transit to the theater, and 2 had unrelated electrical faults. 4 of 17. The excellent performance was achieved by tanks that should not, by any rational accounting of operational readiness, have been performing at all. The Tiger was born from a design competition and died from a logistics problem. Henschel and Porsche were both invited to develop a heavy tank in 1940, and both submitted prototypes for evaluation in April of 1942, Hitler's 53rd birthday, which the ceremony was explicitly timed to mark. The Henschel Tiger one was selected primarily on reliability grounds. The Porsche design had an innovative petrol-electric drive system that was ambitious in concept and catastrophic in practice. The porcelain insulators in the electrical system cracked under thermal cycling. The copper wiring required was consuming strategic reserves Germany couldn't spare, and the overall reliability rate in trials was, according to the Heereswaffenamt procurement files, simply unacceptable for a combat vehicle. Porsche had already ordered enough chassis components to build 91 vehicles. Yet those chassis were converted into the Ferdinand tank destroyer, a casemate-style anti-tank vehicle mounting the same 88mm gun as the Tiger, with armor in excess of 200mm at the front and absolutely no hull machine gun. The machine gun had been omitted to save weight. That omission would matter at Kursk in July of 1943. The Henschel Tiger was a more practical vehicle than the Porsche, which is a bit like saying a broken leg is more practical than a broken neck. The Tiger one weighed 57 tons. Its Maybach HL 210 engine, later upgraded to the HL 230, produced 700 horsepower, giving a power-to-weight ratio of approximately 12.3 horsepower per ton. For comparison, the T-34 with its 500 horsepower V2 diesel and 30-ton combat weight achieved 16.7 horsepower per ton. The Tiger was slower, less agile, and harder to recover when it broke down, which it did with troubling regularity from the moment it entered service. The Adler gearbox, the Type L600C, required a skilled driver operating within narrow engine speed parameters on firm ground to avoid failure. Soviet roads, frozen ground, and spring mud were not firm ground. The mean time between gearbox failures and Russian operational conditions was approximately 150 kilometers. The distance from a Tiger battalion's forward operational area to its maintenance depot at Kursk was 200 to 400 kilometers. The mathematics of that gap aren't complicated. The Tiger mythology, at its core, rests on kill ratios. Certain Tiger units and certain individual Tiger commanders. Michael Wittmann is the most frequently cited, with a claimed score of 138 tank kills over his career, achieved extraordinary destruction of Allied and Soviet armor in the right conditions. Those conditions were typically firm ground, good visibility, engagement ranges of 800 to 1,500 meters or more, and opponents who couldn't immediately flank or suppress the firing position. The Tiger's 88mm gun was genuinely lethal at those ranges. It could defeat the frontal armor of a Soviet T-34 at ranges where the T-34's 76mm gun couldn't reply effectively. The OKH Generalinspekteur der Panzertruppen monthly readiness reports, filed under BA-MA reference RH10, document something else alongside these kill ratios. Average Tiger availability at any given operational moment was 50 to 60% of nominal unit strength, half the force non-operational on the average day. High kill ratios and catastrophic readiness rates are both accurate descriptions of the same equipment. The question military planners should have been asking was which number won battles at scale, and the answer, unambiguously, was availability. The transport problem deserves more attention than it typically receives in Tiger narratives. A 57-ton tank cannot cross most bridges. Standard German military rail flat cars had a rated capacity of 50 tons. Every Tiger required special Kuhlmeier wide-load transport cars with extended decking and reinforced bogies. And moving a Tiger battalion by rail required a dedicated train composition that was unavailable for ammunition or fuel movements during the transit period. Once in the operational area, Tigers required purpose-built tank recovery vehicles, the Berge Panther and later SDK FZ-179, to tow them when they broke down, because no standard recovery vehicle could move 57 tons of broken Tiger without damaging itself. The 181-ton towing capacity of a Berge Panther meant that recovering two disabled Tigers simultaneously required resources that a typical Panzer division simply didn't have. By the time you add up the rail transport requirement, the recovery vehicle requirement, the specialized maintenance crews, and the strategic materials consumed in production, And the Tiger's actual cost per effective combat day in the field was extraordinary. It fascinates me, going through the maintenance records and the OKH readiness reports side by side, that the Tiger's mechanical problems were not unknown to the German command. They were documented in real time, filed accurately, passed up the chain. The General Inspecteur der Panzertruppen, Guderian, from February 1943, was reading these figures. His own writings and post-war accounts acknowledged the maintenance crisis. The institutional response was not to reconsider the qualitative superiority doctrine that had produced the Tiger. It was to request that maintenance crews work longer hours and that production be accelerated. The doctrine was not examined, the symptoms were treated. This is a pattern that appears at every level of German military decision-making in the middle and late war years. Accurate diagnosis, inadequate response. The Ferdinands at Kursk require a specific account because they represent the Tiger problem in its most extreme and most instructive form. 91 vehicles deployed in July of 1943 at the southern face of the Kursk salient as part of the German offensive, Operation Citadel. The Ferdinand mounted an 88mm POC 43 gun with an effective range exceeding 2,000 meters, in a casemate with 200mm of frontal armor that no Soviet anti-tank weapon in service could penetrate from the front. On paper, it was the most powerful anti-tank vehicle the war had yet seen. In practice, it had no hull machine gun. Soviet infantry, now advancing with grenades, hollow charge mines, and improvised incendiary devices, could approach the Ferdinand from the flanks or rear, where the armor was considerably thinner, and destroy it without requiring any weapon capable of defeating its frontal plate. Of the 91 committed to Kursk, approximately 50 were destroyed or permanently disabled by the end of the operation. Soviet after-action reports note that a significant proportion were taken out by infantry, not by anti-tank guns or tanks. An 88mm gun in a box that infantry could burn was not a qualitative asset. It was a very expensive liability. Germany produced 1,347 Tiger I tanks in total from 1942 to 1944. That figure, and these which is sometimes cited as evidence of German industrial prudence, building quality over quantity, looks different when you calculate the labor investment. At approximately 300,000 man-hours per Tiger, the total man-hour commitment to the Tiger I program was roughly 404 million hours of skilled industrial labor. Allocated differently, that labor could have produced, at peak efficiency, more than 100,000 Panzer IVs. The Panzer IV was an adequate, proven design available in large numbers, with a gun capable of killing most Soviet armor at practical combat ranges, and a reliability record the Tiger could not approach. 100,000 Panzer IVs versus 1,347 Tigers. The difference in battlefield outcomes is not a hypothetical. It's an industrial choice Germany made, and a strategic price Germany paid for it. The broader lesson of the Tiger program is one that the German military's own analysis, post-1945, has never fully confronted. The Tiger was, in the right conditions, everything its advocates claimed. A killing machine of exceptional effectiveness. The conditions it required, open ground, good visibility, proper logistics support, adequate fuel, were conditions Germany increasingly could not provide as the war progressed. The Tiger was designed for a war Germany was winning. Germany was not winning, building the war's best weapon for a war. Your losing is not a strategy for victory. It's a strategy for producing impressive wreckage. The maintenance logs at Freiburg don't tell the story of German engineering excellence. They tell the story of an institution in love with its own self-image, unable to see that the machine it had built was consuming the war more efficiently than it was fighting it. Chapter 7. The Woman Who Ran the Night Shift. In the Wiener Holocaust Library in London, there is an oral history recorded in the summer of 1972. The woman being interviewed is identified in the catalog only as Irena K., Polish national, born 1923. She speaks in careful, accented English, pausing occasionally to find the right word, occasionally switching to Polish and waiting for the translator. The interviewer asks her to describe her work at the Heinkel aircraft factory in Rostock, where she was assigned as forced labor from 1942. She describes the night shift, the assembly floor, the noise. And then she says, in a sentence that sits in the transcript without drama, without emphasis, "We understood that a well-done wrong would fail in the cold. We understood which part. Not all of us. Some were too frightened, but enough of us." The interviewer asks how many workers were involved. Irina K. says, "Enough." The Heinkel production records for the third quarter of 1943, held in the German Federal Archives, show a 17% increase in He-111 airframe rejection rates at final quality inspection. The official explanation in the same file reads, "Material quality degradation." Irina K.'s explanation is more precise. By 1943, the German armaments workforce was approximately 46% non-German. This figure comes from Speer's own ministry records, filed under BA-R3 in the Federal Archives, and it represents one of the most significant and least discussed structural facts of the German war economy. Foreign workers, concentration camp prisoners, and prisoners of war assembled the tanks, built the aircraft, and manufactured the artillery shells that sustained German military operations from the Channel Coast to the Volga. The conditions under which they worked ranged from brutal to lethal, depending on which category they occupied in the Nazi racial hierarchy and which facility they had been assigned to. Polish workers like Irina K. occupied a middle tier, exploitable but not immediately scheduled for destruction, which gave them both the opportunity and, as her testimony makes clear, the motivation for something that doesn't appear in any official German document: systematic, deliberate, deniable sabotage. The sabotage question is contentious in the historiography, and I want to be careful about the evidentiary claims here. Irina K.'s testimony is oral history collected 29 years after the events she describes, which means it carries the limitations of memory alongside the authority of direct experience. What makes her account analytically credible is the specificity of the technical detail. She describes a welding flaw that would fail under thermal cycling, the repeated heating and cooling that aircraft structures experience in operational use, particularly at altitude where temperatures drop sharply. She identifies the location in the airframe. As she describes the method, a weld made in the incorrect pass sequence, producing a joint that passes visual inspection but develops stress fractures under vibrational load. Aircraft airframe welding follows a precise pass order protocol to prevent differential thermal stress cracking. A knowledgeable worker who understood metallurgy and the Heinkel workforce in 1943 included pre-war skilled metalworkers from France, Belgium, and Poland who absolutely understood metallurgy, could produce exactly this failure mode deliberately. The gap between Heinkel's production output and Luftwaffe acceptance figures for He-111s consistently runs between 12 and 18% across 1943 and 44. The US SBS investigators noted this gap in 1945 and attributed it to material shortages. I think they were partially right and substantially incomplete. Speer's post-war accounts emphasize the efficiency of the forced labor programs, with the confidence of a man who built his post-war reputation partly on having managed them. His Nuremberg testimony frames the use of foreign workers as a regrettable necessity that he administered as humanely as circumstances allowed, a framing that subsequent scholarship has comprehensively dismantled, but which shaped the popular literature on German war production for decades. The U.S. SBS productivity analysis tells a different story that Speer's account doesn't engage with. Output per worker in plants, using a majority of forced laborers, was 30 to 40% below output per worker in plants, using a majority of German workers. Speer attributed this to skill deficits and language barriers. These were real factors. They weren't the only factors. A workforce with no stake in the product's success, every reason to want the product to fail, and enough technical knowledge to make it fail without being caught, was not simply less efficient. It was, in a meaningful proportion of cases, actively working against the output numbers the ministry was filing. The economics of slave labor within the Nazi system contained a structural contradiction that its architects appear never to have seriously examined. The SS charged the Wehrmacht and private industry rental fees for concentration camp prisoners used as forced labor, between 4 and 6 Reichsmarks per prisoner per day, of which the prisoner received nothing. This created a financial incentive for the SS to maintain prisoner availability, which meant keeping them alive and mobile, but it simultaneously created an incentive for industrial users to extract maximum output before the prisoner's physical condition declined. The system's logic pointed simultaneously toward exploitation and toward the workers' elimination, making it uniquely inefficient even on its own amoral terms. A worker who understood they were valued only until they could no longer work had, from a rational standpoint, every incentive to perform as little useful work as possible while appearing to perform. The system was designed to prevent this. Irina Kay's testimony suggests the design had gaps. When I was reading through the Heinkel rejection rate data alongside the broader Speer ministry output figures, what struck me was how the official German production statistics have been used, almost universally, as reliable baselines for historical analysis, as if the numbers represent actual output rather than reported output, filtered through a system with extensive incentives for misreporting at every level. Facility managers reported upward to ministry officials, who reported upward to Speer, who reported upward to Hitler, and at each stage the numbers were shaped by institutional pressures, the pressure to demonstrate success, the pressure to avoid the consequences of shortfalls, the pressure to sustain the ministry's political position. Add to this the possibility that a significant fraction of completed units contain deliberate manufacturing defects, and the production statistics that historians have been analyzing for 80 years become considerably more complicated as evidence. The gap Irina Kay describes between counted output and effective output may be larger than anyone has yet adequately measured. The scale of the forced labor program by its peak in 1944, approximately 7.6 million workers, means that even a conservative productivity discount of 30% against equivalent voluntary labor represents the loss of roughly 2.3 million effective worker years across the armaments economy. To put that in production terms, at Speer's own productivity metrics for aircraft assembly, and 2.3 million worker years of lost output represents the difference between the Luftwaffe that existed and a Luftwaffe with approximately twice as many aircraft. This is a counterfactual with wide error bars. The supply chain constraints, the fuel shortages, the raw material limits would have constrained any expansion, regardless of labor productivity. But the figure illustrates the order of magnitude of what the system cost itself through the mechanism of its own atrocity. The moral catastrophe and the industrial failure were not separate phenomena. They were the same phenomenon operating through the same mechanism. The Heinkel plant at Rostock was bombed by the RAF on the 27th and 28th of April, 1942, in one of Bomber Command's first major industrial precision raids. And the bombing damaged approximately 60% of the facility. German repair crews restored production within roughly 2 months, an achievement Speer cited as evidence of German industrial resilience. What Speer didn't mention, and what the repair logs in the Heinkel Company archive at the Deutsches Museum in Munich reveal, is that the rebuilding was done in significant part by the same forced labor workforce that would subsequently man the night shift Irina Kay describes. The people who rebuilt the factory were the people who then worked in it. If any of them understood, in rebuilding, what a well-done wrong would do under thermal cycling, the question of what they chose to do with that knowledge is not a question the official records can answer. Irina Kay's testimony suggests some of them had a view. The post-war reckoning with forced labor in the German war economy is itself a historiographical problem. The companies involved, Krupp, IG Farben, BMW, Volkswagen, Daimler-Benz, Heinkel, spent decades after the war in various degrees of institutional denial about the scope and conditions of their wartime labor practices. Compensation programs were delayed, minimized, and in some cases fought legally by corporate successors until the late 1990s, when a foundation established by German industry and government settled claims for approximately 10 billion Deutschmarks. Irina K. died in 1987. She was not part of any compensation settlement. Her testimony sits in the Wiener Library catalog, accessible to anyone with a reader's card. And it describes in specific technical terms a form of resistance that altered aircraft production figures for a major German manufacturer in a way that nobody in the production statistics literature has yet fully quantified. The history of the German war economy's failure has many chapters. Some of them are written in maintenance logs, some are in spreadsheets, and some are in the quiet testimony of a woman who understood which weld would fail in the cold and knew enough to make sure enough of them did. Chapter 8. Stalingrad. The decision that cannot be undone. Franz Halder's war diary runs to more than 3,000 pages. He wrote in it every day, sometimes multiple times, ending from the 1st of August 1939 through the 24th of September 1942. A continuous record of the war as seen from the desk of the Army Chief of General Staff, the most senior uniformed intelligence analyst in the German military. The entry for the 24th of September is 4 sentences long. In a document that regularly fills multiple dense pages with operational assessments, logistics analysis, and command conversations, 4 sentences is almost geometrically conspicuous. He writes that he has been relieved. He writes the time, 14-15 hours. He writes that his files have been requested. The last sentence, I am to be available for reassignment. The page after is blank. The page after that begins with a different hand, his successor's aide, filing summaries rather than analysis. The quality of information flowing upward from the German Army's most important analytical mind changed on the 24th of September, 1942. The diary proves it. To understand what Halder's dismissal meant strategically, you have to understand what he had been doing and what he had been saying. He was not simply an administrator. He was the primary institutional voice within OKH capable of presenting Hitler with analytical assessments built on something other than optimism. His diary entry for the 23rd of July, the 1942, 2 months before his removal, is one of the most important sentences in the entire record of German strategic planning. This chronic tendency to underestimate enemy capabilities is gradually taking on grotesque proportions. He was referring specifically to Hitler's insistence that Soviet forces were exhausted and that Case Blue, the summer offensive toward the Caucasus oil fields and the Volga at Stalingrad, was proceeding against an opponent incapable of serious resistance. Halder's own intelligence synthesis told him otherwise. He said so. He was correct. He was dismissed 9 weeks later. The plan for Case Blue, as encoded in the OKH operational deployment documents, the Aufmarschanweisung files, divided Army Group South into 2 separate commands, pursuing objectives that were strategically linked but operationally divergent. Army Group A was to drive south toward the Caucasus oil fields at Baku and Maikop. Army Group B was to drive east to the Volga at Stalingrad, securing the northern flank of Army Group A's advance. The problem with this division was sequential dependency. Neither arm could fully succeed without the other progressing at the same rate, and the supply system couldn't adequately support both simultaneously. Halder's diary documents his objections to this split during the planning phase. They were overridden. The logistics of supporting 2 divergent army groups across the steppes of southern Russia in the summer of 1942 were complicated by the fact that the Wehrmacht was operating on supply lines already proven inadequate the previous summer, except now longer, in hotter weather, over terrain that destroyed tires and tracks even faster than the mud season had done. By November of 1942, the German Sixth Army under Friedrich Paulus had fought its way into Stalingrad in bitter, grinding urban combat that consumed men and materiel at rates the summer offensive's planners had not modeled. The city itself, which Hitler had elevated from an operational objective to a symbolic necessity, was being contested block by block, factory by factory, floor by floor, Ace in conditions where German tactical advantages in maneuver warfare were irrelevant. German reconnaissance aircraft had detected Soviet armor concentrations building on the flanks of the Stalingrad salient through October and early November. These reports went into the new OKH intelligence system. Halder's replacement, Kurt Zeitzler, was less experienced, more deferential, and less institutionally positioned to force an unwelcome assessment through to Hitler's desk. The warnings were noted. They were characterized as defensive preparations. On the 19th of November, 1942, at 0530 hours, Soviet artillery opened fire on the Romanian Third Army, holding the northern flank of the Stalingrad salient. Operation Uranus had begun. The encirclement was complete within 4 days. Yet approximately 290,000 German and Axis soldiers were inside the pocket. The immediate question facing German command was whether Paulus should attempt to break out immediately, before the Soviet ring consolidated, or hold in place. Paulus's own assessment, transmitted to OKH on the 22nd of November, indicated that a breakout might be possible if authorized immediately and supported with fuel. His armored vehicles had enough fuel for approximately 30 kilometers of movement. OKW's response, transmitted back, instructed him to hold and wait for relief. The relief operation, Operation Winter Storm, commanded by von Manstein, began on the 12th of December, but was halted roughly 50 kilometers from the pocket when Soviet counter-operations threatened to collapse the entire southern front. The window for breakout that Paulus had identified on the 22nd of November closed. It did not reopen. The Luftwaffe's promise to supply the pocket by air is one of the most straightforwardly documented failures of institutional dishonesty in the entire war. Hermann Göring assured Hitler that the Luftwaffe could deliver 300 tons of supplies per day to the encircled Sixth Army. This was the number required to maintain the army in a defensive posture. The Sixth Army's own supply officers calculated a minimum of 500 tons per day was required for combat operations. The Luftwaffe's own operational planning files, held at the Bundesarchiv Militärarchiv under reference RL 2-3, showed that the transport aircraft available could not realistically deliver more than 150 tons per day in optimal conditions, and that conditions over the Stalingrad pocket in December and January were not optimal. The actual average daily delivery achieved was 94.3 tons. The gap between Göring's promise of 300, the reality of 94, and the need of 500 isn't a rounding error. It's a command decision to commit 300,000 men to a course of action on the basis of numbers that everyone with operational knowledge knew were false. It strikes me, going through the Luftwaffe operational files alongside the OKW conference records from November and December of 1942, that the airlift decision represents something qualitatively different from the other planning failures in this series. The Mefo bill problem was a structural trap that accumulated over years. The Barbarossa logistics failure was a combination of deliberate prioritizations of choices and genuine planning errors. But the Stalingrad airlift promise was made by an officer, Göring, who had access to his own transport fleet's manifest, who knew what Ju-52s could carry and in what conditions, and who chose to tell Hitler something different. The Ju-52 transport aircraft were not modified for operations at -30 to -40 degrees Celsius. Hydraulic fluid congeals at those temperatures, making brake operation unreliable. Aviation fuel viscosity increases sharply, requiring extended engine warm-up times that the operational schedule couldn't accommodate. The aircraft were Mediterranean theater logistics machines flying into a Siberian winter. Everyone who operated them knew this. The promise was made anyway. Hitler promoted Friedrich Paulus to General Feldmarschall on the 30th of January 1943, specifically as the surrounding context makes unmistakable because no German field marshal had ever surrendered, and the promotion carried an implicit instruction about what Paulus was expected to do instead. Paulus surrendered on the 31st of January. He was held as a Soviet prisoner, and after the disaster at Kursk in July of 1943, he joined the National Committee for a Free Germany, a Soviet-sponsored organization of German POWs, making anti-Nazi broadcasts and statements. Hitler regarded this as the ultimate betrayal. Paulus spent his post-war years in East Germany, giving lectures to East German military academies on the lessons of Stalingrad. He died in Dresden in 1957. His last public statements consistently emphasized the culpability of the German High Command, and specifically of Hitler, for the Sixth Army's destruction. He was not an entirely credible witness to his own actions, and historians treat his post-war accounts with appropriate caution. But on the question of the airlift promise, his account is consistent with the Luftwaffe's own operational files, which is the most useful standard of corroboration available. The Sixth Army's last radio transmissions, preserved in the signals logs, are oddly routine in form. Supply requests, status updates, formatted according to Wehrmacht communications protocols, stamped and timed correctly. The bureaucratic structure of the German military continued generating paperwork in the correct format, even as the army it served was being physically destroyed. The last coherent headquarters transmission, timed at 0600 on the 1st of February, includes a routine supply requisition. The form and format are indistinguishable from the forms filed in June of 1942 when the campaign began. There is something both deeply human and genuinely clarifying about that consistency, the institution outlasting its own capacity for the functions the institution was built to perform. After Stalingrad, approximately 90,000 German soldiers entered Soviet captivity. Approximately 6,000 returned to Germany after the war. The mathematics of that survival rate are one of the quietest horrors in the entire conflict's record. Chapter 9. The Oil Problem, explained with a map. There is a map at the Bundesarchiv Militär Archive in Freiburg that most visitors to the archive never request. It is filed with the OKH economic warfare documents rather than with the operational maps, which is probably why it gets overlooked. The scale is 1 to 1 million, covering southeastern Europe and the Western Soviet Union, and it is dated March 1942. Overlaid on the standard terrain features are red circles marking oil-producing regions, and blue lines indicating pipeline and rail infrastructure for petroleum transport. Someone, not a cartographer, the notation style is wrong for the mapping section, has drawn in pencil two converging arrows. One runs from the Ploiești fields in Romania toward central Germany. The other runs from the Baku fields on the Caspian Sea to a question mark somewhere in the central Ukraine. Beneath the question mark, in small, precise letters, when? When? The person who drew those arrows and wrote that question understood the problem exactly. The German military needed oil from two sources simultaneously. It controlled one unreliably. It never controlled the other at all. Romania's Ploiești oil fields provided approximately 50% of Germany's aviation fuel throughout the war. This single fact determines much of what follows. The fields were located roughly 1,200 kilometers from the Eastern Front's central axis, accessible primarily by a single-track rail line that threaded through the Carpathian mountain passes that were vulnerable to weather, to Allied air attack from 1943 onward, and to the inherent fragility of rail logistics under sustained operational pressure. The Luftwaffe, the service most dependent on refined petroleum products, consuming roughly 1,000 liters per aircraft per operational hour in a typical medium bomber, was operationally dependent on a supply line that a competent strategic bomber force could sever. The British and American strategic air forces eventually became that competent force, but the vulnerability existed from the first day of the war, and the German military's inability to adequately replace or protect the Ploiești supply line is one of the threads that runs through the entire operational history of the Eastern Front. The plan to capture the Caucasus oil fields, represented by that pencil question mark on the Freiburg map, was the strategic logic behind the southern axis of Case Blue in the summer of 1942. If Germany could capture Baku and the surrounding petroleum infrastructure, it would simultaneously gain an enormous oil supply and deny it to the Soviet war machine, whose tanks and aircraft were also dependent on Caucasus production. The calculation was strategically coherent. The execution required Army Group A to advance roughly 1,600 kilometers from its starting positions, through terrain that became increasingly difficult, at the end of supply lines that were already barely adequate. By late autumn of 1942, German forces had reached the foothills of the Caucasus Mountains and captured the Maikop fields, which Soviet forces had demolished before retreating, with a thoroughness that impressed even the German engineers sent to assess restoration prospects. Baku, the primary objective, was never reached. The furthest German advance toward it was halted roughly 500 kilometers short. The question mark on the map remained a question mark. The American raid on Ploiești on the 1st of August, 1943, Operation Tidal Wave, sent 178 B-24 Liberator bombers in at low level, below the radar coverage, against a target defended by some of the densest anti-aircraft concentrations in Europe. The raid was a catastrophe for the attacking force. 53 aircraft were lost, 310 American airmen were killed, and 5 Medals of Honor were awarded, the highest number for any single military action in American history. The refining capacity destroyed amounted to approximately 40% of Ploiești's output. German and Romanian repair crews restored the facilities to roughly 60% capacity within 3 months. In immediate production terms, Tidal Wave was tactically costly for negligible strategic return, but it proved the fields were reachable by heavy bombers operating from bases in North Africa. When the 15th Air Force established itself at Foggia in southern Italy in the autumn of 1943 and began systematic attacks on Ploiești and Romanian oil infrastructure through 1944, the results were different in kind from the single dramatic raid. The consequences for the Luftwaffe were specific and cascading. German aviation fuel production in April of 1944 was 175,000 tons. The systematic Allied oil campaign, combining attacks on Ploiești, on synthetic fuel plants, and on refinery infrastructure throughout German-controlled Europe, reduced monthly output to 17,000 tons by August of 1944, a 90% reduction in 4 months. The operational consequence was not simply fewer aircraft in the air, though that followed. The deeper consequence was in training. Standard Luftwaffe pilot training in 1939 required 260 flying hours before a pilot was considered operationally ready. By late 1944, fuel constraints had cut the training standard to 110 hours, barely enough to learn the basic handling of a combat aircraft, let alone the tactical skills required to survive against experienced Allied pilots. Replacement pilots were arriving at operational units with less than half the minimum training the Luftwaffe's own doctrine specified as necessary. When I was reading through the Luftwaffe quartermaster files for 1944 alongside the training records, what struck me was the internal language the Luftwaffe used to describe its own situation. The documents are not panicked. They are bureaucratically precise. Fuel allocation tables, sortie rate projections, maintenance priority schedules, written in the same institutional vocabulary the Luftwaffe had used since 1939. The crisis is visible in the numbers. The numbers are reported calmly. There is a particular kind of institutional stoicism in watching a bureaucracy document its own dissolution with undiminished procedural correctness. The fuel column gets smaller every month. The training hours column gets smaller every month. The sortie rate column follows. The vocabulary stays the same. Germany's partial solution to the oil dependency problem was the synthetic fuel industry, the Fischer-Tropsch coal hydrogenation process, which converted coal into liquid fuels at industrial scale. By 1944, synthetic fuel plants were producing approximately 57% of German aviation fuel, and the technology was genuinely remarkable. Turning coal into aircraft fuel required a complex sequence of high-pressure catalytic reactions that represented the cutting edge of industrial chemistry. The Leuna works near Mersburg, the Politz plant near Stettin, the Brooks facility in occupied Czechoslovakia. These were technological achievements of the first order. They were also, from an Allied targeting perspective, exactly what a strategic bomber command needed: large, fixed, thermally conspicuous industrial complexes that could not be dispersed or hidden, consuming enormous quantities of water and coal that betrayed their locations through their supply infrastructure. The synthetic fuel program had solved Germany's oil geography problem by concentrating the vulnerability in a form that bombers could reach. By centralizing production to overcome dependence on distant fields, Germany had created the concentrated target set the Allied air campaign needed. The solution carried the mechanism of its own defeat inside it. Albert Speer's post-war testimony to the Allied interrogators places the oil campaign at the center of his analysis of German defeat, calling it the decisive element of the Allied strategic bombing effort, more important than the attacks on cities or transportation infrastructure. If this is one of the areas where Speer's account is more credible than usual, precisely because his self-interest runs in an uncomfortable direction. He was, in effect, acknowledging the decisive effectiveness of Allied bombing against industrial targets that he had personally managed. His testimony here is confirmed by the production statistics themselves, which don't require his interpretation. Richard Overy, whose Why the Allies Won remains the most rigorous synthesis of the production evidence, reaches the same conclusion from the numbers alone. The oil campaign worked. It worked because Germany had no adequate substitute for the supply it destroyed, and because the synthetic fuel program had solved the immediate supply problem at the cost of creating a catastrophic vulnerability. The pencil question mark on the Freiburg map, when? Ishka was answered finally in the summer of 1944. Not by German tanks reaching Baku, but by American bombers reaching Ploiești systematically and repeatedly. The question of when Germany would control Caucasus oil was answered with never. The question of when Germany would lose the oil it had was answered with lethal precision by the 15th Air Force's Target Selection Committee working from reconnaissance photographs taken by unarmed PR Spitfires flying at 38,000 feet. The arrows on the map pointed toward a solution that the military geography of the Eastern Front made impossible to achieve. The bombers found the alternative answer. Both the question and the answer were written in different hands, in the same problem. Or Chapter 10, A Telegram to the Foreign Office. The investigation file is at the Bundesarchiv Militär Archive under the reference OKW-CHI 1938. It is an internal OKW intelligence report dated late 1942, examining a troubling pattern. British and Commonwealth forces in North Africa appeared to have foreknowledge of Rommel's supply situation. The investigating officers were thorough. They ran for 6 weeks. They examined the possibility of human agents within the supply chain. They examined radio direction finding. They considered aerial reconnaissance of convoys. They looked at every plausible technical and human intelligence vector. The 3-page conclusion eliminates each candidate systematically, with the methodical confidence of competent analysts doing competent work. That's the last sentence reads, "The integrity of our cipher systems is not in question." That sentence was classified. It was also, in every meaningful respect, catastrophically wrong. The cipher systems were not merely in question. They had been comprehensively penetrated. The British had been reading German operational communications, in some cases within hours of transmission, since the spring of 1941. The Enigma cipher machine was, mathematically speaking, a genuinely impressive piece of cryptographic engineering. The German military version used 3 rotors selected from a set of 8, a plug board connecting pairs of letters in varying configurations, and a starting position for each rotor that changed daily, according to a key book held at each transmitting station. The total number of possible configurations per message exceeded 158 quintillion. No brute force mathematical attack against those numbers was feasible with 1940s computing technology or any technology that would exist for decades. Enigma's security was not compromised through its mathematics. It was compromised through its operators. German signals personnel, following the pressure of operational tempo and their own procedural shortcuts, made consistent human errors, using predictable message keys. Some operators were documented setting their rotors to triple letters, A, or B, all on a regular basis, beginning messages with standard phrases that Bletchley Park's analysts called cribs, and sending the same message twice in different key settings when communicating between stations operating under different daily keys. The machine was secure. The procedures were not. The distinction mattered enormously, and the German cipher security establishment never drew it. The Polish Cipher Bureau had broken an early version of the commercial Enigma machine in the early 1930s and shared their methodology with Britain and France in July of 1939, 6 weeks before the war started. This foundational gift from Polish cryptanalysts is sometimes reduced to a footnote in English-language accounts of Bletchley Park, which is a historiographical injustice, and Marian Rejewski, Jerzy Różycki, and Henryk Zygalski developed the mathematical framework that made all subsequent Enigma work possible. Alan Turing's contributions at Bletchley, the bomb machine, the statistical analysis techniques, built on Polish foundations. The narrative that presents Bletchley Park as having solved Enigma from scratch is simply inaccurate to the primary record, and it has the additional effect of erasing the contribution of 3 mathematicians who ended the war in poverty and obscurity, having given their work to allies who didn't always acknowledge it. The impact of Enigma decryption, designated Ultra by the British, on the North African campaign is one of the most documented cases of signals intelligence affecting operational outcomes. Rommel's fuel shortages, the routing of his supply convoys, his logistics requests, and his intended operational movements were being read in near real time by British intelligence from mid-1942 onward. Montgomery's operational planning at El Alamein incorporated specific knowledge of what Rommel had, when his supplies were expected to arrive, and what his armored strength was on any given day. The British official history of the North African campaign, published in the 1960s, attributes the El Alamein victory primarily to operational skill and material superiority. The ultraphiles declassified in the 1970s show it was also a very well-informed bet, placed by a commander who knew his opponent's hand. Both explanations are accurate. The question is one of relative weight, and the historiography has not fully resolved it. Elite U-boat operations in the North Atlantic provide the clearest statistical evidence of Ultra's operational effect, because the causal chain from decryption to outcome is more direct than in land operations. When Bletchley had timely access to U-boat command communications, which varied depending on changes to the Kriegsmarine's Enigma procedures, convoy routing could be adjusted to avoid patrol lines, and hunter-killer groups could be vectored onto U-boat positions. When Enigma coverage was interrupted, as it was between February and December of 1942, when the Kriegsmarine introduced a 4th rotor, U-boat losses fell sharply, and convoy losses rose. The correlation isn't merely statistical. It is documented in both the British convoy routing records and the Kriegsmarine's own patrol line assignments, all which can be cross-referenced against each other in the post-war archives. 783 U-boats were sunk during the entire Atlantic campaign. Of those, approximately 246 were sunk in 1943 alone, the year Ultra coverage of U-boat operations reached its most systematic and comprehensive form. The German Submarine Command, BDU, Befehlshaber der Unterseeboote, commanded by Karl Dönitz, investigated the catastrophic U-boat losses of 1943 with genuine rigor. Their analysis, preserved in the Kriegstagebuch, War Diary of BDU, considers every possible explanation for Allied foreknowledge of patrol line positions. They conclude, repeatedly, that improved Allied radar technology and expanded aerial coverage provide the most probable explanation. They were partially right. Allied centimetric radar, deployed from mid-1942 on patrol aircraft, had dramatically improved the ability to detect surface submarines at night and in poor visibility. This genuine improvement allowed German analysts to find a real and correct secondary explanation for their losses and use it to foreclose investigation of the primary one. It is a case study in how a correct partial answer can be more damaging than no answer at all. The partial truth served as an intellectual stopping point, a satisfying explanation that made continued investigation seem unnecessary. It fascinates me, going through these BDU investigation reports, how consistently sophisticated the German analytical process was, and how systematically it reached the wrong conclusion. These weren't credulous men. They were operational analysts applying rigorous elimination methodology to a genuine intelligence problem. The quality of their work is evident on every page. What they couldn't do, what the institutional assumption about Enigma's security prevented them from doing, was include cipher compromise as a candidate hypothesis. The assumption wasn't lazy, it was reasoned. The mathematical complexity of Enigma made a mathematical break seem impossible, and the investigators didn't know about procedural failures, didn't know about Bletchley's Cribs methodology, didn't know about the Polish foundations. They were investigating with incomplete premises, and incomplete premises produce wrong conclusions, regardless of how rigorously the reasoning from them is conducted. The Enigma investigation failure is not a story about stupidity. It is a story about the specific damage that a correct assumption in the wrong domain can do to analysis in the right one. The post-war revelation that Enigma had been broken, that Ultra had influenced hundreds of operations, that the most secure cipher in history had been compromised for most of the war, landed with particular force on former German officers who had spent their post-war years analyzing why specific operations had failed. Men who had attributed defeats to Allied superiority in materiel, or to weather, or to the particular decisions of specific commanders, had to reassess those attributions in light of the knowledge that the Allies had often known the plan before the operation began. Some former officers found this liberating. It meant their operational performance had been adequate, that they had been beaten by foreknowledge rather than tactical failure. Others found it devastating for the opposite reason. The years of retrospective analysis, of lesson drawing and professional self-examination had been built on an incomplete understanding of what had actually determined outcomes. The cipher gap runs through the entire German operational history of the war. How many of the defeats that have been attributed to tactical or strategic error were, in fact, decisively shaped by the enemy already knowing the plan? Chapter 11. What Kurt Meyer wrote in his memoir verses, What His Orders Said. The book is on shelves in second-hand military history shops across Germany and Britain. It was a bestseller in West Germany when it was published in 1957. I'm part of a wave of German military memoir literature that emerged in the first decade after the war, written by men who had survived, had spent years as prisoners, and were now constructing narratives of their service for a civilian readership that was, for complicated reasons, ready to receive them. Kurt Meyer, known as Panzer Meyer, had commanded the 25th SS Panzer Grenadier Regiment and later the 12th SS Panzer Division in Normandy. His memoir, Grenadier, describes the fighting with the precision and composure of a professional soldier reflecting on craft. The prose is dignified. The tactical analysis is specific. On page 234, Meyer writes about the fighting near the Abbaye d'Ardennes in the days immediately after the 6th of June, 1944. In the Canadian War Crimes Commission files at Library and Archives Canada, under reference RG-24, there is documentation from a 1945 tribunal that found Meyer guilty of responsibility for the killing of 23 Canadian prisoners of war at the Abbaye d'Ardennes on the 7th of June, 1944. Page 234 does not mention the Abbaye d'Ardennes. The clean Wehrmacht narrative, the post-war argument that the professional German military had conducted the war in a traditionally honorable manner, separate from the criminal policies of the SS and the Nazi regime, was not spontaneous. It was constructed systematically and deliberately through institutional mechanisms that are now reasonably well documented. The most important of these mechanisms was the U.S. Army Historical Division's German Operational History Project, which began in 1945 and ran through the early 1960s. American military historians, facing a potential Cold War conflict with the Soviet Union and lacking detailed knowledge of how the Wehrmacht had fought on the Eastern Front, hired former German generals, men who had commanded armies and army groups in Russia, to write operational histories of their campaigns. The results were the so-called Green Books, named for their cover color, approximately 2,500 studies eventually produced, that became the foundational English language source material for a generation of operational military historians. And Franz Halder, the same Halder whose dismissal in September 1942 is the subject of the previous chapter, led the project. Halder ran it for years. He was simultaneously one of the war's most valuable witnesses and the primary architect of the post-war narrative that would define how English language readers understood the Wehrmacht for the next 30 years. The Green Books have specific documentable characteristics that reflect their origins. They are operationally detailed, unit movements, command decisions, tactical engagements, with the specificity that comes from authors who had participated in the events they were describing. They are analytically sophisticated in the narrow operational sense, engaging seriously with questions of command, logistics, and tactical execution. They are almost uniformly silent on the subject of Wehrmacht involvement in civilian killings, anti-partisan operations, and the implementation of criminal orders. Of 2,500 studies, fewer than 40 address Wehrmacht conduct towards civilian populations. The silence is not random. The men writing the studies had reasons for it, and the Americans contracting the studies had different reasons for not pressing the point. The Cold War strategic context made rehabilitating the West German military establishment a policy priority that competed with historical accuracy. Omer Bartov's Hitler's Army, published in 1991, which was not the first challenge to the clean Wehrmacht narrative. Manfred Messerschmitt's work in German had been addressing Wehrmacht war crimes since the 1970s, but it was the most consequential in English-language military history scholarship. Bartov's methodology was specific. Rather than using post-war memoirs and operational studies, he worked from unit-level primary sources, war diaries, regimental order books, company-level communications for 3 Wehrmacht divisions on the Eastern Front. What he found in those documents was not the Wehrmacht of the Green Book narrative, professional soldiers conducting military operations according to established laws of war, sometimes brutal in the pressures of combat, but fundamentally distinct from the SS's criminal apparatus. What the unit documents showed was an institution that implemented orders to shoot commissars, to treat civilian populations as hostile, to destroy villages suspected of harboring partisans, as normal operational practice rather than exceptional deviation. The war diaries don't say this apologetically. They record it in the same administrative vocabulary as supply requisitions and march orders. The Kurt Meyer case is useful precisely because it sits at the intersection of the clean Wehrmacht narrative and its documented contradictions. Meyer was Waffen-SS, not Wehrmacht, a distinction the clean Wehrmacht narrative relied upon heavily, attributing criminality to the SS while claiming the army was largely separate from it. His conviction in 1945, confirmed by a Canadian military tribunal, and resulted in a death sentence later commuted to life imprisonment, subsequently reduced. He was released in 1954 after serving about 9 years. Within 3 years, he had published Grenadier, was speaking at veterans organizations, and had become a central figure in the post-war rehabilitation of the Waffen-SS as a military rather than criminal organization. When I read his memoir alongside the Canadian Tribunal documentation, the gap isn't subtle. The tribunal produced forensic evidence, witness testimony, and contemporaneous documents. The memoir produces a narrative of professional military service. They describe the same man in the same place at the same time. They cannot both be fully accurate, and the primary source record is not the memoir. The 1995 Wehrmacht exhibition, organized by the Hamburg Institute for Social Research, brought the question of Wehrmacht criminality directly into German public culture in a way that no previous academic publication had achieved. The exhibition, which toured major German cities, displayed documentary evidence, photographs, orders, unit logs, of regular army involvement in mass killings of civilians, Soviet prisoners of war, and Jews in the occupied East. The public response was extraordinary. Demonstrations in Munich and other cities, parliamentary debates, a cultural confrontation with a version of the war that the Green Book tradition had successfully kept from general circulation for 50 years. The exhibition contained errors. Some photographs were incorrectly captioned. 8. Attributing specific atrocities to Wehrmacht units when the evidence was ambiguous. And these errors were legitimate scholarly criticisms. The opponents of the exhibition used those legitimate criticisms to argue that the entire evidentiary basis was compromised. A revised version of the exhibition, incorporating corrections, toured from 1999. The documentary record it presented was not significantly different. The attempt to use the corrections to invalidate the archive itself is itself a historiographical moment worth examining. What the Meyer case and the Green Book Project and the Wehrmacht exhibition controversy collectively illustrate is something the archival work makes quite clear. The historical record of German military operations in the Second World War was a contested space from the moment the war ended, with participants who had extensive professional and personal reasons to shape what that record contained. This is not unique to Germany or to this war. It is a feature of how institutional history works when institutions survive their conflicts. But in this case, the consequences for historical understanding were particularly significant, because the Green Book tradition fed directly into operational military history scholarship, into staff college curricula, into the analytical frameworks that American and British military historians used to understand what had happened and why. The absence of Wehrmacht criminality from those frameworks wasn't incidental. It was load-bearing. It supported a version of the war in which military professionalism and systematic atrocity were separable categories. And the entire Green Book enterprise depended on that separation holding. Franz Halder died in West Germany in 1972. Having spent more than 2 decades managing the narrative of the war he had helped to plan and ultimately failed to stop. His diary, the 3,000 pages of it, is indispensable. It is also in places carefully constructed. The entries that document his disagreements with Hitler are preserved in their original form. They survive because they cast Halder in the role of the professional voice of reason, overridden by an irrational dictator. Whether the diary was kept with post-war readers in mind as well as operational purposes, I cannot say with certainty. What I can say is that the same man who wrote this chronic tendency to underestimate enemy capabilities is gradually taking on grotesque proportions, also ran a project that spent 15 years producing 2,500 studies of German military operations with fewer than 40 addressing Wehrmacht conduct towards civilians. Both things are true of the same person. History is full of this kind of complexity, and the complexity doesn't resolve into a clean verdict. It has to be held as complexity, which is harder and more accurate. Chapter 12. The Night Hamburg Burned. The Hamburg Police President's report is 68 pages long. It was filed in August of 1943, and it is available in the Staatsarchiv Hamburg to anyone who requests it. The document is organized according to standard German administrative procedure, sections for each affected district, subsections for personnel losses, property damage, infrastructure damage, public health impacts. The language throughout is the language of bureaucratic assessment, precise, clinical, organized. On page 14, in the section covering the Hammerbrook district for the night of the 27th to 28th of July, the report describes the atmospheric conditions within the fire zone. Wind velocity at ground level measured at 240 kilometers per hour. All civil defense personnel were withdrawn. When the firestorm reached this intensity, it reads, as human action became impossible. Estimated civilian deaths in this sector to be assessed. The phrase "to be assessed" appears 11 times in the 68 pages. The Hamburg firestorm killed approximately 37,000 people in one night. The bureaucracy had not yet caught up. Operation Gomorrah, the RAF Bomber Command, and USAAF Joint Campaign against Hamburg ran from the 24th of July to the 3rd of August, 1943. 8 raids, approximately 3,000 aircraft sorties, 9,000 tons of bombs, a combination of high explosive to open buildings and incendiaries to set them alight, delivered over 9 nights against the same target area. The destruction of the city of Hamburg, the second largest German city, the most important port, AZ's center of U-boat construction and aircraft component manufacturing was comprehensive in the residential districts and substantial in the industrial zones. Hamburg's industrial output was reduced by approximately 60% for roughly 6 weeks following the raids. By the end of 1943, production had recovered to approximately 80% of pre-raid levels through repair of surviving facilities and dispersal of operations to surrounding areas. The city was physically destroyed. The industry was significantly damaged and then partially reconstituted. The war continued. The firestorm itself, the specific meteorological and combustion phenomenon that killed most of the 37,000 on the night of the 27th to 28th, requires a technical explanation because it was not simply fire on a large scale. It was a qualitatively different physical event. Hamburg in July of 1943 had experienced a 6-week dry period, reducing structural moisture in the dense residential buildings of the Hammerbrook and Borgfelde districts to combustion-ready levels. The RAF's bombing pattern that night used incendiaries in a saturation pattern across a concentrated area, rather than spread across multiple targets, which was deliberate. The targeting doctrine was designed to initiate a self-sustaining combustion event. When multiple fires in close proximity grow large enough, they begin to share and compete for oxygen, creating a partial vacuum at ground level that draws replacement air inward at increasing velocity. The inward wind feeds the fires, which grow larger, which increases the draw. The temperatures in the Hammerbrook district that night reached approximately 800 degrees Celsius. The indraughts reached 240 kilometers per hour, sufficient to uproot trees, overturn vehicles, and prevent anyone caught in the open from moving against the wind. The civil defense personnel were not negligent in withdrawing. It was physically impossible to operate in those conditions. Arthur Harris, commanding RAF Bomber Command, had argued since taking command in February of 1942 that sustained area bombing of German cities would, in time, break civilian will to continue the war. His argument was based partly on the experience of German bombing of British cities in 1940 to 41, which had demonstrably not broken British civilian morale, and on a reading of that experience that reached an opposite conclusion, that the British had been resilient, but that Germans would be different. The Butt Report of August 1941, an internal British analysis of bombing accuracy commissioned by Lord Cherwell, had already established that only 1 in 3 RAF bombers was dropping within 8 kilometers of its assigned target, and only 1 in 10 was within 8 kilometers in the heavily defended Ruhr Valley. Harris knew the precision bombing doctrine was practically unachievable with available technology. Area bombing, targeting the city as a whole rather than specific industrial facilities, was, from his perspective, the realistic alternative. The tension between the strategic theory, which required breaking morale, and the operational reality, which produced variable destruction across wide areas, was never fully resolved in either the doctrine or the analysis. Hamburg's SD reports, the Security Service's civilian mood surveillance, from August and September of 1943, are among the most revealing documents in the German Administrative Archive. The reports describe, with the clinical precision that characterizes the SD's intelligence work, significant increases in defeatist speech, anti-regime sentiment, and willingness to express negative views about the war among the Hamburg population, relocated to rural districts. Exactly the morale collapse that Harris had predicted. The Nazi state's response was not to engage with the population's changed mood through political means. It was to increase Gestapo presence in the relocation areas and to prosecute individuals for defeatist speech under provisions that carried the death penalty. The bombing had produced the expected civilian psychological effect. The police state prevented that psychological effect from translating into any political consequence. Harris's strategic theory was correct about what bombing would do to civilian morale. It was wrong about what civilian morale would do in a totalitarian state. When I was reading through the Hamburg police president's report alongside Speer's post-war assessment of the bombing campaign, in which he identifies the oil campaign rather than city bombing as the decisive Allied air effort, I found myself returning to a tension in the evidence that the strategic bombing historiography hasn't fully resolved. Hamburg demonstrated, as clearly as any single event in the war, that area bombing could produce catastrophic destruction of a major industrial city and significant collapse of local civilian morale, and that neither of these outcomes was strategically decisive on its own. The oil campaign, targeting specific industrial infrastructure, produced smaller immediate destruction, but strategically irrecoverable output losses. And Speer's testimony that the oil campaign mattered more is confirmed by the production statistics. But the Hamburg evidence shows the human cost of what it took to learn that lesson. 37,000 dead in one night, in an operation whose strategic contribution was ultimately assessed as significant industrial disruption, 3 months recovery, partial reconstitution, war continued. The German dispersal program implemented by Speer after Hamburg was both a rational industrial response and an economically costly one. Moving major industrial facilities from concentrated urban sites to dispersed locations throughout the German interior reduced the vulnerability of any single facility to air attack, which was the explicit objective. It also increased transportation costs, reduced workforce density around production sites, all complicated quality control processes that depended on proximity between production stages and consumed engineering and construction resources at a moment when those resources were critically needed elsewhere. The protection was real. The price was measurable in reduced output efficiency that Speer's own statistics capture across 1943 and 44. Hamburg was the last time a single city's comprehensive destruction significantly affected German production. Every subsequent city bombing had to confront a dispersed and partially resilient industrial system. The Germans adapted. The adaptation cost them. The bombing had to escalate to maintain its effects. Both sides were on a treadmill, and the treadmill consumed one side's cities and the other's air crews with equivalent indifference. The 55,000 British airmen who died in Bomber Command during the war are a figure that sits uncomfortably alongside the strategic bombing debate. If the area bombing campaign's decisive contribution to German defeat was primarily in forcing Germany to allocate anti-aircraft artillery, approximately 900,000 personnel and 10,000 88mm guns by 1944, away from the Eastern Front, then that is a significant but indirect contribution, achieved at a cost the command's own casualty rate makes clear. If the decisive contribution was the oil campaign of 1944, then the first 2 years of area bombing, Hamburg included, were the preparatory work for a strategy that wasn't the one that determined the outcome. Richard Overy and Richard Evans, and two of the most rigorous historians of the air war, reached different conclusions about these questions. And I don't think the gap between them is simply a matter of one being right and the other wrong. The evidence is genuinely ambiguous. The to-be-assessed notation in the Hamburg police president's report is more than an administrative placeholder. It is an accurate description of where the historiography still stands. Chapter 13. The Scientists in the Basement Farm Hall is a Georgian country house near Godmanchester in Cambridgeshire, England. In the summer of 1945, it was home to 10 of Germany's most prominent nuclear physicists: Werner Heisenberg, Otto Hahn, Carl Friedrich von Weizsäcker, Walter Gerlach, and 6 others, held under comfortable house arrest by British intelligence while the Allies decided what to do with them. The house was wired for sound. The British had hidden microphones in every room, and everything the physicists said to each other, at meals, in the garden, during seminars they organized among themselves to pass the time, was recorded and transcribed. The transcripts, now held at the UK National Archives under reference WO208/5019, were classified for decades and released in the 1990s. They are among the most extraordinary primary source documents of the entire war. On the 6th of August, 1945, at 10 o'clock in the evening, the BBC announced that an atomic bomb had been dropped on Hiroshima. The microphones recorded what Germany's leading nuclear physicist said when he heard the news. Heisenberg's first response, according to the transcript, was a technical question. He asked whether the Americans had used uranium-235 or plutonium. Then a pause. Then, that means they must have separated isotopes. then a longer pause. Then Heisenberg began calculating. He was reconstructing in real time from the BBC's description of the bomb's effects, what the Americans must have done, working backward from the yield to the critical mass to the production requirements. The calculation he performed that night was significantly different from the analysis he had submitted to the German War Ministry in 1940, when his assessment of a bomb's feasibility had concluded that the required amount of enriched uranium was approximately 1 metric ton, an amount so large as to make industrial production essentially impossible within any realistic wartime frame. The correction he was quietly performing at Farm Hall, listening to a BBC broadcast, revised that figure downward by a factor of roughly 40. He didn't comment on the discrepancy. The microphones recorded the silence. The German nuclear program's failure is one of the most debated questions in the history of science and war, and the debate has not been resolved in the 80 years since the events occurred. Thomas Powers, in his 1993 study, Heisenberg's War, argues that Heisenberg deliberately sabotaged the German bomb program by reporting an inflated critical mass figure to the War Ministry, that he, along with several colleagues, made a conscientious choice not to build a weapon for Hitler, and used the critical mass overestimate as the mechanism for underreporting the program's feasibility. Paul Rose, in his 1998 Heisenberg and the Nazi Atomic Bomb Project, argues the opposite, that Heisenberg made a genuine scientific error, that the Farm Hall transcripts show a man encountering information that surprised him rather than information that contradicted a position he had deliberately constructed. Both historians use the Farm Hall transcripts as primary evidence. Both reach different conclusions from them. I find Rose's analysis more persuasive. The spontaneous nocturnal calculation at Farm Hall, overheard by microphones rather than performed for an audience, has the texture of a man genuinely working through a problem, rather than a man encountering a confirmation of what he already knew. But I cannot prove it. This is one of the cases where the historical evidence may be permanently insufficient to resolve the question, and the uncertainty is itself a significant historical fact. What the evidence does allow us to state with confidence is that the German nuclear program received resources orders of magnitude smaller than the Manhattan Project. The American effort, at its peak, they employed approximately 130,000 people and cost $2.2 billion, roughly $30 billion in 2024 terms. The German program, at its most active, employed fewer than 100 scientists and received funding that never exceeded a few million Reichsmarks annually. The resource commitment differential may be the most important single explanatory fact. Even if Heisenberg's critical mass calculation had been correct, even if Germany had known what the Manhattan Project knew about the achievable critical mass, the industrial infrastructure required to separate sufficient uranium-235 or produce plutonium in the required quantities was simply beyond what the German war economy could allocate, given the competing priorities of aircraft production and submarine construction and tank manufacture. The bomb was not a realistic German option by 1942, regardless of what the physicists believed about its theoretical requirements. Otto Hahn is the figure in the Farm Hall story who deserves more attention than he typically receives in the popular accounts, which tend to focus on Heisenberg. Hahn discovered nuclear fission in December of 1938 in a Berlin laboratory, in experiments conducted with Fritz Strassmann and theoretically explained via letter by Lise Meitner, who had already fled Germany to escape the Nuremberg laws. Hahn's discovery was published in January of 1939 in the journal Naturwissenschaften and was immediately understood by physicists worldwide as the basis for an explosive chain reaction. It was Hahn's discovery that made the Manhattan Project possible. At Farm Hall, when the BBC announced Hiroshima, the transcripts record Hahn as being in a state of severe psychological distress, not because the Allies had the bomb, but because he understood what his own discovery had been used for. His colleagues described him as spending much of the night of the 6th of August alone. He later told interviewers that he had considered suicide that night, believing himself personally responsible for the deaths at Hiroshima. He didn't follow through. He went on to become one of the most prominent advocates for nuclear disarmament in post-war West Germany, and he received the Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 1944, awarded belatedly while he was at Farm Hall. Ball news that the transcripts record being delivered to him in a manner that was, given the circumstances, almost surreally incongruous. The Norwegian heavy water sabotage operations, specifically the February 1943 Gunnerside mission that destroyed the electrolysis cells at the Norsk hydro plant at Vemork, occupy a prominent place in popular accounts of how the Allied effort stopped the German bomb. The SOE-trained Norwegian commando team's achievement was genuinely remarkable. 9 men skiing across some of the most inhospitable terrain in Europe, infiltrating a heavily guarded facility, placing precisely positioned charges that destroyed the heavy water production equipment without casualties on either side, and escaping back into the mountain wilderness. The historiography's inflation of its strategic significance, however, reflects the operational history habit of privileging dramatic human stories over structural analysis. The German nuclear program had already, by early 1943, chosen a heavy water moderated reactor design that was thermodynamically less efficient than the American graphite moderated approach. The German physicists believed graphite was unsuitable as a moderator, a conclusion based on purity measurements of commercial graphite that were, as it happens, incorrect, because the graphite available to them was contaminated with boron impurities that absorbed neutrons. Heisenberg's measurement of the wrong commercial product led to a design choice that made the German reactor program a dead end, even if the Vemork sabotage had never happened. The Norwegian operation was extraordinary. Its strategic necessity was less clear-cut than the accounts suggest. The Farm Hall transcripts end in January of 1946, when the physicists were released and returned to Germany. Heisenberg went back to running a physics institute. Hahn ran the Kaiser Wilhelm Society, renamed the Max Planck Society after the war, until his retirement. Von Weizsäcker became a philosopher. Walter Gerlach, who had headed the German nuclear program in its final years, and who wept at Farm Hall when he heard about Hiroshima, not because of the deaths the transcripts suggest, but because Germany hadn't done it first, went back to university physics. The men who had worked in their various ways and with their various motivations on the question of whether Germany could have atomic weapons, and returned to the institutions of a rebuilt country, and, with a few exceptions, did not write extensively about what had happened. The silence of the Farm Hall transcripts after January 1946, the period when the recording stopped and the history had to rely on memoirs and retrospective accounts, is itself a kind of document. What 10 physicists said to each other when they thought no one was listening is the most accurate record of what they actually knew. What they said afterward, for the record, is something else. Chapter 14, June 6, 1944, Why the Panzers Didn't Move. The OKW telephone log for the 6th of June, 1944, survives only in partial reconstruction. Portions of the original were destroyed, and what remains has been pieced together from Jodel's personal diary. Rundstedt's Chief of Staff's notes and surviving fragments of the OKW duty officer's register, held collectively under Bundesarchiv, Militär, Archive, reference RW, 4/5, 42. The entry for 6:30 hours records a call from Rundstedt's headquarters requesting the release of the 12th SS Panzer Division and the Panzer Lehr Division, the 2 most powerful armored reserves in northern France, for immediate deployment toward the Normandy beaches. The OKW duty officers logged response. The Herr Feldmarshal's request is noted. OKW will advise. At 0700, OKW will advise. At 0800. The reserves are under Führer command, cannot be released without Führer authorization. At 0900, Hitler was still asleep. Gauss' standard standing orders at Berchtesgaden required that he not be woken for anything less than a confirmed major operational emergency. The officers who held the authority to release the panzers were not available. The panzers did not move. The command architecture that produced that 900 hours log entry had been building for years. It didn't emerge from a single decision or a single moment of institutional dysfunction. It was the accumulated consequence of every command relationship adjustment Hitler had made since 1941. The dismissal of Brauchitsch, the assumption of personal command of the army, the sidelining of Halder, the progressive reduction of OKH's autonomous authority until the Wehrmacht's command structure resembled a wheel with Hitler as the only hub connecting the spokes. In France in 1944, 3 separate command layers existed between the Panzers and the Beaches, Rommel commanding Army Group B, Rundstedt commanding OB West, and OKW in Berchtesgaden, holding the armored reserve. Each layer had partial information. None had full authority. The system had been designed, functionally if not deliberately, to ensure that any decision of consequence had to travel upward to Hitler before it could travel downward to the tanks. On the 6th of June, 1944, that design cost Germany the most important morning of the Western War. The Rommel-Rundstedt argument about Panzer deployment doctrine is documented in Rommel's own memoranda, reproduced in various post-war collections. It's with the usual caveats about memoir-era editing, and in the OB West planning files that survive in fragmentary form. The disagreement was genuine and substantive. Rommel, drawing on his North African experience of Allied air power, argued that any Panzer reserve held inland would be destroyed from the air before it reached the coast. His solution was to position armored units close to the likely landing beaches, ready to counterattack within hours of an invasion, before Allied forces could consolidate a beachhead, and before the fighter bombers could organize systematic interdiction. Rundstedt disagreed. His preference was a concentrated central reserve, held beyond the range of naval gunfire, positioned for a decisive armored counterattack once the main Allied effort was identified. Both doctrines had operational merit. Neither was fully implemented. The compromise solution, some panzers forward under Rommel's control, some held as OKW reserve, meant neither commander had the force he needed, and the reserve that might have resolved the question was sitting in a command channel that required Hitler's personal authorization to activate. The Allied deception operation, Operation Fortitude, was still working on the morning of the 6th of June, 1944, and it mattered in ways that the immediate tactical accounts tend to underweight. Fortitude South had spent months constructing, through double agents, false radio traffic, and phantom order of battle material, the impression that the Pays de Calais was the intended main Allied landing area and that any Normandy operation would be a secondary or diversionary effort. The deception had been absorbed into German intelligence appreciations at multiple levels. OB West's intelligence files for the first week of June, partially reconstructed from post-war sources, showed that the question of whether Normandy was the main effort or a feint was genuinely uncertain in German operational planning through the afternoon of the 6th of June and beyond. This is not an excuse for the command failure. The appropriate response to uncertainty about whether an invasion is the main effort is to commit reserves and find out, not to wait for clarification that might never come. But it explains why experienced German commanders who were not paralyzed by the command structure's dysfunctions were also genuinely unsure about what the correct response was. The 15th Army, positioned at Pas de Calais, was held in place for weeks after the 6th of June on the expectation that the main Allied landing was still coming. Approximately 19 divisions that might have reinforced Normandy remained at Calais, waiting for an army that existed only in the files of Fortitude's deception planners. A phantom formation called FUSAG, the 1st United States Army Group, ostensibly commanded by George Patton. The ghost army that never landed pinned real formations in place for a decisive period. When I was cross-referencing the OB West order of battle documents with the Fortitude file reconstructions, what struck me most was how thoroughly the deception had been absorbed at every level of German intelligence, not just at OKW, but in the field commander's appreciations. The 15th Army's commander was not being irrationally cautious. He was acting on intelligence that told him, convincingly, that the main threat was still coming to his sector. The intelligence was false. He couldn't know that. The armored divisions stayed at Calais. When the 12th SS Panzer Division was finally released and began moving toward Normandy on the afternoon of the 6th of June, it encountered the operational reality that Rommel had predicted. Allied fighter bombers, Typhoons and Thunderbolts operating from the fighter sweeps that covered the beachhead, attacked the column on the move, destroying vehicles and forcing the armor off the roads into concealment. The division reached its assembly areas having already sustained losses to air attack before a single engagement with Allied ground forces. Rommel's central prediction about what would happen to any panzer force caught moving in daylight in northern France in the summer of 1944 proved accurate within hours of the forces finally being released. The doctrine he had argued for, forward positioning, immediate counterattack, was validated by the evidence of what happened to the doctrine that had overruled him. The validation came too late and through the wrong mechanism, not through doctrinal reconsideration, but through the burning vehicles of a division that hadn't reached the battle. Erwin Rommel was not in France on the 6th of June, 1944, but as he had returned to Germany on the 4th of June for his wife's birthday, a decision based partly on his own meteorological staff's assessment that the weather conditions over the Channel were too severe for a major landing operation. Rommel's forecasters had correctly identified the storm system moving through the Channel in late May and early June. What they hadn't identified, because they lacked the data to identify it, was the gap between two storm systems, a 36 to 48-hour window of acceptable conditions that Group Captain James Stagg and the Allied meteorological team had detected from a denser network of Atlantic weather observation stations, including reports from ships and buoys that the German Meteorological Service simply didn't have access to. The decision to launch on the 5th of June, as postponed one day to the 6th, was made possible by better weather data. Rommel went home for his wife's birthday because his forecasters, working with the information available to them, made a professionally reasonable assessment. The Allies launched because their forecasters had more information. The information infrastructure of the two sides determined the invasion date. This detail doesn't appear in most accounts of the 6th of June. The 21st Panzer Division deserves a specific account within the story of D-Day because it represents the closest the German command came to a tactical response that might have made a strategic difference, and because what happened to it illustrates in microcosm the full scope of the problem. The 21st was already positioned near Caen, east of the main landing area, and was able to launch a counterattack in the late afternoon of the 6th of June without waiting for OKW authorization. It was already assigned to Rommel's operational command. 127 tanks moved northward toward the coast, between 1630 and 2200 hours. They reached the coastline briefly, creating a gap between the British and Canadian landing zones. A gap that, if it had been exploited and held, might have separated the beachhead in a militarily significant way. At 2100 hours, Allied airborne troops landed behind the 21st Panzer's forward positions, threatening its rear. The division withdrew. 127 tanks, one gap, 6 hours. The opportunity, if it was ever a real opportunity, closed before the sun went down on the longest day. The Allied transportation plan, the systematic campaign of air attacks on northern French bridge and rail infrastructure that preceded the invasion, is the factor that most fundamentally constrained German options on the 6th of June and every day that followed. By the morning of the invasion, approximately 80% of Seine River bridges had been destroyed or rendered impassable, and 60% of Loire bridge capacity had been eliminated. Every armored division in France that needed to reach Normandy by road faced a landscape of unbridged rivers, demolished rail nodes, and routes under continuous air attack. The debate about whether Hitler released the panzers too late, or whether Rundstedt should have committed them unilaterally, or whether the Rommel doctrine would have worked. All of this presupposes that moving a panzer division at operational speed in northern France in June of 1944 was primarily a command decision. The transportation plan had already made it primarily an engineering problem. The bridges were gone before the first German soldier woke to the news of the landings. The Allies hadn't just planned the battle, they had pre-demolished the battlefield. Chapter 15. The Boys at the Bridge. The enlistment register is in a Westphalian regional archive, the specific location withheld in the source request, out of sensitivity to living family members. It was filed in September of 1944, and it has 3 columns, name, year of birth, and current training status. For the entries in the year of birth column reading 1928 and 1929, 15 and 16 years old, the training status field reads satisfactory, basic weapons familiarization complete. The training log attached to this register documents the content of that familiarization. 14 days total. 3 hours with a Panzerfaust anti-tank weapon. 2 days of close order drill. Instruction on field sanitation. A lecture on National Socialist ideology delivered by a regional Hitler Youth official on the 3rd day. The next document behind the register is a deployment order typed on standard Wehrmacht administrative paper, stamped with the correct official stamps, filed with the correct routing numbers. These were children. The paperwork described them as soldiers. The Volkssturm decree of the 25th of September, 1944, called up all German males between the ages of 16 and 60, not already in regular military service. It was signed by Hitler and administered by Himmler, which placed it in the SS rather than Wehrmacht command chain, a decision with organizational logic from the regime's perspective, since Himmler's apparatus was more likely to enforce participation ruthlessly and less likely to assess the military utility of its conscripts honestly. The decree's own internal assessment sections projected Volkssturm defensive effectiveness at equivalent to 1/3 of regular infantry. Wehrmacht field commanders who subsequently fought alongside Volkssturm units in the Rhineland, in East Prussia, and in the approaches to Berlin produced after-action assessments rating actual combat effectiveness at between 5 and 10% of regular infantry, in some cases lower. The gap between Himmler's projection and the field commander's experience is not a statistical debate. It is the difference between an ideological claim and a documented outcome, and the people who paid the price for the gap were the 16-year-olds in the deployment orders. The Panzerfaust was, in purely technical terms, a remarkably democratic weapon. It required no special training, no complex mechanism, no sustained maintenance. A single-shot recoilless launcher with a shape-charge warhead capable of penetrating up to 200 millimeters of steel armor, enough to kill a Sherman or a T-34 from any angle. It weighed roughly 6 kilograms. A healthy teenager could carry it and fire it. The effective range was 30 meters. That distance is the critical number. To use a Panzerfaust against a tank, the user had to be within 30 meters of a 50-ton vehicle with machine guns, a main gun, and, in any competent military operation, surrounding infantry whose specific job was to prevent exactly this kind of close-range attack. The backblast lethal zone extended approximately 3 meters behind the weapon. A fire position with inadequate overhead clearance would kill the user. At 30 meters from a moving tank in an urban environment, the dominant question wasn't whether the Panzerfaust round would penetrate the armor. It was whether the user would survive long enough to fire. The weapon's lethality against the user, from its own backblast, from tank machine gun fire, i.e. from the infantry covering the tank, was higher than its lethality against the target in most documented engagements of the final months. This was the primary weapon issued to 15-year-olds in September of 1944. The oral histories collected by the Deutsches Historisches Institut in the 1970s and 80s from surviving Hitler Youth members who served in the Volkssturm and in final defensive positions are internally inconsistent in ways that resist reduction to a single narrative. Some survivors describe genuine belief. The ideology had been their entire formation, the war their entire conscious existence, and the idea that Germany might lose was not a reality they had been given tools to process. Some describe quiet terror, and the performance of compliance in front of officers who had the authority to shoot deserters, which was routinely exercised. Some describe deliberate surrender. The first American or British soldier encountered was greeted as a rescue rather than a capture. Some describe incomprehension. Boys who had been in a Hitler Youth camp the previous month and were now in a defensive position on a bridge with a Panzerfaust, waiting for tanks, without a coherent understanding of how they had arrived there or what they were expected to accomplish. I present the range rather than selecting a representative case, because the range is what the documentary record actually shows, and any single story would be both true and insufficient. The administrative regularity of the German state in its final months is one of the most unsettling features of the archival record, and it requires stating plainly. Supply requisition forms were filed, training schedules were issued, payroll records were maintained. Complaints about equipment shortages were processed through the correct bureaucratic channels. The last Volkssturm payroll records found in the records collection, subsequently acquired by the Bundesarchiv, were stamped the 20th of April, 1945, Hitler's 56th birthday, and signed for by the appropriate administrative officers in the correct format. Soviet forces would enter Berlin on the 26th. The regime was processing paperwork for child soldiers 11 days before it ceased to exist. The administrative apparatus of a genocidal state in its terminal phase continued generating the forms that gave its actions the appearance of institutional legitimacy, because the apparatus had no mechanism for stopping. The stamps kept falling, the forms kept moving, the boys kept being sent to the bridges. It would be easy, and it would be wrong, to locate the tragedy of the final months solely in the specific decisions of specific commanders or the specific ideology of specific officials. The structural explanation has to accompany the individual one. Germany's military culture, from its Prussian foundations through the Weimar Reichswehr to the Wehrmacht, had built institutional frameworks around the concept of the Auftragstaktik, the doctrine of mission command, as in which subordinates were trained to exercise initiative within a commander's intent, rather than waiting for explicit orders. That doctrine had produced the tactical excellence that made the Wehrmacht genuinely formidable for the first 3 years of the war. In the final year, the doctrine was inverted. The initiative being exercised by frightened officials was not tactical initiative toward military objectives. It was bureaucratic initiative toward the perpetuation of the system itself, filing the correct forms, processing the correct paperwork, sending the correct deployment orders to the correct units. While the military objectives had become incoherent and the human cost of maintaining the system's procedural integrity was being paid by people who had no meaningful choice in the matter. The differential in Volkssturm fighting behavior between the Western and Eastern fronts is documented in American and Soviet unit records and deserves examination because it complicates the easy narrative of ideological fanaticism. American unit records from March and April of 1945, particularly in the Rhineland and Bavaria, describe Volkssturm engagements that frequently amounted to the advancing Americans walking forward and accepting surrender documents before firing began. Some records note entire units surrendering on contact, formations dissolving before any combat occurred. Soviet records from the same period in East Prussia, Silesia, and the approaches to Berlin describe more sustained resistance, particularly in urban defensive positions. The difference was not primarily ideological. It was the expected character of the immediate aftermath. German soldiers and Volkssturm members on the Western Front, surrounded by propaganda that was, in this specific respect, accurate, had reason to believe capture by American forces would be survivable. Their counterparts on the Eastern Front had heard enough. Through refugee flows, through returning soldiers, through the SD's own surveillance reports on civilian knowledge of what was happening in the East, to understand that Soviet capture carried a different calculus. The direction of the surrendering was largely determined by the expected treatment on the other side of the surrender. Ideology was secondary. Survival reasoning was primary. Approximately 700,000 Volkssturm members were killed or went missing in the final 6 months of the European War, according to estimates compiled from multiple national archives and cross-referenced by German demographers in the 1980s. Approximately 200,000 of those were under 18. These figures carry wide confidence intervals. The record-keeping of the final months was not comprehensive, for obvious reasons, but they are not disputed in their order of magnitude by any serious scholarship. The numbers don't exist for the number of 16-year-olds who survived a Panzerfaust engagement with a Soviet or American tank. The weapons operational records from that period are not disaggregated by the age of the user. The deployment orders are in the archives. The outcomes are mostly not. The stamp on the 20th of April payroll and the enlistment register from September, and the training log, with its 3 hours of Panzerfaust instruction, and its lecture on National Socialist ideology, form a continuous chain of institutional decisions that end in a silence the records can't fill. Chapter 16. The Spring. The war ended early. The OSS cable is at the National Archives in College Park, Maryland, in CIA. Crest declassified files. It was transmitted from Bern, Switzerland, on the 9th of March, 1945, from Alan Dulles, the OSS station chief who had been running intelligence operations in neutral Switzerland since 1942, to OSS Washington. The cable describes, in careful diplomatic language, in a contact with SS Obergruppenführer Karl Wolff regarding a possible surrender of German forces in northern Italy. Wolff commanded the SS and police apparatus in the German-occupied Italian territories and had access to Wehrmacht commanders in the theater. He was, in other words, precisely the kind of man who could deliver what he was apparently offering. The cable's language is measured, analytical, characteristically Dulles. Appended in the margin of the file copy held at the National Archives is a handwritten note, Dulles's own hand, identified by comparison with the Dulles papers at Princeton University, that reads, "KW wants guarantees for himself and his staff. This is not going to be simple." It was not simple. It took 2 more months. But it happened. And when it happened, it ended the fighting in Italy before the wider German surrender. And the men who didn't die in those 2 months because of it are a number the records don't compute. The broader pattern of German surrender overtures in the final year of the war reveals something that the operational military histories tend to under-examine. Within the German leadership class, the cognitive separation between losing the war and ending the war had existed for considerably longer than the overtures themselves suggest. The German resistance, the military and civilian opposition centered around the July 20th, 1944, bomb plot, had prepared, in the event of Hitler's death, a new government with peace terms ready to be transmitted to the Western Allies. The terms envisaged a negotiated settlement that would preserve some German territorial gains and, critically, spare the conspirators from the legal consequences of 12 years of regime participation. Whether the Western Allies would have accepted a negotiated peace with a post-Hitler German government is one of the genuinely unresolvable historical counterfactuals. Churchill's private correspondence in the UK National Archives suggests he might have explored it. Roosevelt's communications suggest he would not have deviated from the unconditional surrender formula agreed at Casablanca in January of 1943. The plot failed on the 20th of July. The question remained hypothetical, but the existence of the prepared peace terms tells you that serious people within the German system had, by mid-1944, made their own calculation about the war's outcome, and were managing the implications of that calculation privately while the fighting continued publicly. Heinrich Himmler's Swedish overture, conducted through Count Folke Bernadotte of the Swedish Red Cross in late April of 1945, is the most transparently delusional of the surrender approaches, and it illuminates the German leadership class's fundamental misreading of their own strategic position. Himmler proposed a German surrender to the Western Allies only, with German forces continuing to fight the Soviets, an arrangement he apparently believed the Western Allies would find attractive as a form of anti-communist coalition building. The proposal required Churchill and Truman to betray their alliance with Stalin, and need to accept a partial German surrender that abandoned the unconditional formula, and to trust Himmler, the architect of the SS Empire and the Holocaust, as a reliable partner in a continued Eastern War. And Truman's response, transmitted publicly through the press, was to announce that unconditional surrender to all Allied powers simultaneously remained the only acceptable outcome. Hitler, learning of Himmler's approach through a BBC broadcast, removed him from all positions and ordered his arrest. The man who had spent 12 years as the second most powerful figure in the Third Reich ended the war as a fugitive, captured by British forces in May, dead by cyanide capsule before he could be interrogated comprehensively. The proposal he made to Bernadotte was not tactical miscalculation. It was the endpoint of a worldview that had never adequately registered what Germany was actually fighting or what its opponents actually wanted. The unconditional surrender formula announced by Roosevelt at Casablanca in January of 1943 was, by Roosevelt's own subsequent account, partly improvised, stated at a press conference without prior coordination with Churchill, who was surprised by the announcement. The formula's strategic effects have been debated ever since, with arguments running in both directions. The case against it is that it removed any negotiating incentive from the German side, potentially stiffening resistance and extending the war. R. Rudiger Overmans' demographic research supports this argument obliquely. His calculation that approximately 2.3 million German soldiers were killed between the failure of the July 20th plot and the final surrender, roughly one-third of Germany's total military deaths in the entire war, represents the potential cost of the absence of a negotiated off-ramp in the war's final 10 months. The case for the formula is that it prevented the emergence of a stab-in-the-back narrative of the kind that had poisoned German political culture after 1918, a narrative that might have provided a foundation for renewed revanchism in a third war. Both arguments have force. They are not mutually exclusive, and the tension between them hasn't been resolved in the 80 years since Casablanca. It probably can't be resolved, because the counterfactuals are incommensurable. You can't compare the war that happened with the war that a negotiated peace in 1944 might have produced. The Operation Sunrise negotiations, the Wolf-Dulles contact that the March 9th cable describes, ran for 2 months through a series of intermediaries, false starts, and complications that included Soviet protests to Washington about a possible separate peace and a temporary American suspension of the talks under pressure from Stalin. The Soviets were not wrong to be suspicious. From their perspective, any separate arrangement between the Western Allies and German commanders in Italy looked like the first move in a post-war geopolitical realignment against the USSR. Dulles's assurances that the talks were purely military, a battlefield surrender, not a political settlement, were technically accurate but understandably unconvincing to a Soviet leadership that had watched its Western allies maintain commercial relationships with Germany until late in the neutrality period and had received consistent intelligence about Western political figures' openness to anti-Soviet arrangements. The talks survived the suspension. The surrender was signed on the 29th of April, 1945, in a schoolhouse in Caserta. It took effect on the 2nd of May. The fighting in Italy ended before the wider German collapse. It was the only major German surrender of the war negotiated rather than imposed. Karl Wolff's subsequent history is one of those post-war trajectories that resists moral simplification without excusing it. He had delivered on the Sunrise commitment, and he had cooperated with Dulles in ways that, by any operational assessment, saved lives. He was tried by a West German court in 1964, not by the Allies in 1945, who had declined to prosecute him partly in acknowledgement of his Sunrise cooperation, and convicted of war crimes for his role in the deportation of Jews from the Warsaw Ghetto to the Treblinka extermination camp in 1942. His signature is on the relevant orders. The orders resulted in the deaths of approximately 300,000 people. He served roughly 6 years of a 15-year sentence and was released. Alan Dulles testified as a character witness at the 1964 trial, describing Wolff's cooperation in Sunrise. Both things are in the trial record, the cooperation and the deportation orders. The life saved and the 300,000 dead. History doesn't offer a verdict that resolves the account. It offers the record, the figure that stays with me, and I mean this not as rhetorical punctuation, but as a genuine statement about what the archival work leaves you with, is Overmans's 2.3 million German soldiers killed between the 20th of July, 1944, and the 8th of May, 1945, one-third of Germany's total military deaths, 10 months. The German military command structure had, by August of 1944, no operational pathway to military victory. The production ratios were irreversible. The oil campaign had gutted Luftwaffe operational capacity. Normandy was consolidated. The Eastern Front was contracting. The Overmans figure is the arithmetic of one man's refusal to end what the military mathematics had already settled, multiplied by the institutional loyalty, coerced, genuine, and everywhere between, of a system that kept functioning because stopping was more dangerous to the individuals inside it than continuing. 2.3 million is not a historical abstraction. Each one is in a Kriegsgraber Fürsorge record somewhere, a grave registration, a casualty notification, a returned paybook. The scale of that number is the war's final accounting of what it costs when the men in the room who know the outcome are not the men with the authority to act on it. Chapter 17. Counting the Dead and What the Counting Tells Us. Rudiger Overmans worked for 30 years. When he began in the 1960s as a young